Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the dark, echoing corridors of the medieval world, where stone walls are thick and secrets run deeper than any well. Picture this. You're trudging along a moonlit alley in a town that never seems to sleep, except you're not after bread or ale or even the safety of your own bed. You're listening for the creak of a wooden door, a voice that calls only at night, a life lived almost entirely in shadows. Above, the cathedral's spire juts against the velvet sky, looming, judging. Your footsteps fade into a hush, because in the Middle Ages, if your desires veered off the map, you didn't just keep quiet, you disappeared into silence. You probably won't survive this, at least not as your honest self. So, before we go any further, if this quiet space makes you feel even a little less alone, you can like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Are you lying awake in a quiet room at 2 a.m, or maybe starting your day in a rainy city, eyes still heavy? Drop your time and place in the comments. Let's remind each other we're not alone out here. Now dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey. Together, here on Timeless Sleep. You glance over your shoulder. You can't help it. Everyone does. This is a world where confession isn't a choice but a duty, and you've spent your life ducking beneath that heavy net of expectation. The stone walls around you are meant to keep invaders out, but their true genius is how well they keep feelings in. It's almost funny, if you ignore how many hopes have been quietly bricked up in basements like unwanted relics. The church is everywhere here, inescapable as the morning bell. You smell it in the incense, feel it in the way people avoid each other's eyes, hear it in the constant, anxious chime of prayers muttered beneath breath. You're told, over and over, that desire, especially your kind of desire, must be buried, stifled, confessed, and scrubbed away like a stubborn wine stain on a white linen altar cloth. If your feelings don't fit the mould, it's not just wrong, it's sinful, and everyone, it seems, is watching. Still, the world keeps moving. You pass through streets sticky with the scent of horse dung and frying onions, past houses that crowd together like secrets told at midnight. The people around you perform their daily rituals, the baker's quick blessing, the smith's gruff handshake, the ever-present genuflection as someone scurries past a stone saint glaring down from a church archway. No one speaks of longing here, at least not yours. Instead, they murmur about the price of salt or how the weather will ruin the crops, as if hunger is only ever about food. That's the thing. You learn to read between the lines. A baker who never marries, a shepherd with soft eyes, two women who share a cottage at the edge of town. Everyone has their explanations, whispered in corners, tucked behind raised hands. It's the oldest game. Just friends, someone says. Just an oddity. Of course, sometimes odd is the nicest thing you'll hear. The church, your ever-present shadow, dictates so much of this. Its power doesn't just flow from the pulpit or confession box. It's in the way entire towns bend themselves to avoid its wrath. Sin is a word that floats over every conversation, pressing down on you like a damp woolen cloak. And queer desire, it's the shadow behind the shadow, the thing so dangerous that most people won't even name it out loud. Historians still argue whether the church's obsession with rooting out hidden sin was born from fear, control, or just plain confusion. Maybe all three. One thing's for certain. Sermons against unnatural vice become more colourful each year, painting unnamed acts with a palette of dread. Abomination, they say, unnatural, against the order of God. The language is broad on purpose, a net big enough to catch even those who barely stray. If you're unlucky enough to get caught, the punishment can be severe. Or worse, the punishment can be silence, isolation, and a lifetime spent erasing yourself one memory at a time. Yet here you are, breathing in this night air, aware that your very existence is a balancing act. You learn to speak in code, to watch for danger as naturally as you reach for bread at supper. There's a certain irony in all this. Medieval society is obsessed with sin but rarely mentions pleasure. The very idea that someone might want something outside the norm is for many more disturbing than war, plague, or famine. You could be a thief, a liar, even a murderer and still hope for forgiveness, but not this. For this, there are prayers, and then more prayers, and a silence so deep it becomes its own kind of death. But you're not alone, even if it feels that way. You've heard stories, everyone has, about others who live behind the same mask. Sometimes you even spot them. A fleeting look at a feast, a hand that lingers too long on a friend's shoulder, a note slipped quietly into a pocket. There's a whole vocabulary of glances and small gestures, an underground language learned by necessity. The church might build the walls, but you and those like you find ways to tunnel under them. A nod, a half smile, an extra loaf of bread left at a doorstep. These are your confessions, as holy and desperate as any whispered in a dark box. Let's not sugarcoat it. This is a world of constant fear. There are stories of men dragged from their beds, women exiled or worse for the suspicion alone. You live with a kind of hyper-awareness, never quite at rest. There's a joke in some towns that people confess more out of habit than guilt, a survival tactic just in case. But for you, confession is never safe. It's the place you go when there's nowhere else left. There are no parades here, no rainbow banners, just candles burning low and the slow drip of time. And yet every so often, you hear about someone who's managed to carve out a space for themselves, if only for a moment. The church, for all its vigilance, is not all-seeing. There are corners where light doesn't reach, villages so remote that rumours lose their sting. Even in the heart of the city, behind those stone walls, people find each other. Sometimes it's just a glance or a song sung quietly over the laundry. Other times it's a promise made by moonlight, never to be spoken again. It's worth noting, mainstream history barely glances at this side of medieval life. Chronicles are full of wars, coronations and plagues, but almost silent on the subject of desire. When queer love is mentioned at all, it's as a cautionary tale or an accusation. You're written into the margins, if at all. Scholars today dig through letters, poems and trial records, finding fragments of lives spent evading not just punishment, but memory itself. You wonder, if you had lived more openly, whether your story would survive, or simply be erased more quickly. Oddly enough, some of the most elaborate church rituals were born out of a desire to control people's bodies and their souls. Pilgrimages, fasts, penance, all meant to keep you busy, tired, and guilt-ridden. You look at the relics lining the altar, bones, shreds of cloth, the odd golden cup, and wonder how many of these belong to people who loved like you. Maybe none, maybe all. Historians still argue whether the church's relic trade was ever truly about holiness, or just another way to keep people's attention focused on anything but themselves. But here's a secret. People will always find ways to reach out even when the world tells them not to. A knight writes a poem about an unnamed beloved. A nun carves a heart into a hidden wall. Two boys sneak away to fish, talking in code. The church rails, the townsfolk whisper, but desire is stubborn. It's the one thing you can't lock away forever, no matter how high you build the walls. Sometimes in the dim quiet of Vespers, you notice a pair of eyes meeting across the pews, just for a second. That's all it takes. A momentary connection that says, I see you. Maybe that's all anyone ever really wants. To be seen, even in a world that insists on looking away. Now let's not ignore the irony of all this. The church spends so much time warning people about forbidden pleasure that you can't help but wonder if they're worried it might actually be, well, pleasurable. At one point, a bishop gives a 3-hour sermon about the sin that dare not speak its name, without ever actually saying what it is. You'd laugh if it weren't so exhausting. It's a medieval version of I can't tell you what it is, but don't do it or you'll burn. You leave wondering if you're more likely to combust from the guilt or just from boredom. All this creates a strange sort of kinship among outsiders. You may never speak directly about your desires, but you share in the same glances, the same whispered jokes, the same sense of being just a little outside the world everyone else claims to inhabit. You are, in your way, a secret society, not by choice, but by necessity. And while the world insists on seeing only sin or sickness, you keep living, loving, laughing when you can. And you dream. Sometimes, just before sleep, you let yourself imagine a different world, one where desire isn't policed by stone walls and pointed sermons, but allowed to grow wild, like herbs in an untended garden. You picture lovers holding hands in daylight, songs sung without fear, stories written in ink instead of erased by fire. The reality is harsher, of course. The world you live in isn't likely to change, not for centuries anyway. Still, in every age, someone finds a way to laugh, to love, to slip past the guards. It's not much, but sometimes it's enough. You settle back, eyes heavy, letting the world outside the window fade to grey. The church bells ring in the distance, their sound both warning and comfort. You think about how many people have heard those bells, each with their own secrets. The night is long, and the walls are thick, but you are still here. That, for now, is enough. You're drifting further now, following the thread of your own breath as the city outside sinks into sleep. All around, the medieval night is thick with secrets. If you tilt your head, you might just hear them. A sigh from an open window, the soft shuffle of feet on ancient flagstones, the hiss of wind teasing its way through cracks in the stone. The world is quiet, but the silence is never empty. It's filled with things left unsaid. Words have always been tricky here. In the Middle Ages, what you can't say can sometimes speak loudest. You listen for the words no one dares utter, the names never written down, the promises couched in riddles. That's how you stumble into the next layer of this labyrinth, the hidden echoes of queer love in medieval literature. For every official sermon or stern chronicle, there's a poem, a song, a scrap of a story with meaning curling at its edges like smoke. If you ever flip through a crumbling manuscript by candlelight, and really, who hasn't done that at 3 a.m. after a bout of medieval insomnia, you notice something odd. The texts written by monks and nobles, scribes and songsmiths are full of longing. So much yearning that you'd think half the population was about to elope with a mysterious stranger. Yet, those desires almost never point in the direction you expect. Love is described in riddles, gender is left ambiguous, and sometimes a hero's closest companion gets far more poetic description than any poor maiden at home. Historians still argue whether all this was simply literary tradition, or something much deeper. Either way, the ambiguity is the point. You've probably heard of the courtly love tradition. The idea that noble knights poured out their souls for unreachable ladies, sometimes writing long elaborate verses about their pain. But look closer, and you'll find things aren't so straightforward. In some Arthurian romances, a knight's deepest emotional connection is with his fellow knight, not the queen. There are entire poems written in voices that slip between genders, where the beloved is simply you, and the reader is left to fill in the details. It's a game, one you play every night after all. There's something delicious about it, this literary cat and mouse. You picture a monk hunched over his desk, quill scratching away, heart pounding as he decides whether to change a pronoun or to leave it floating, a secret to be guessed at centuries later. Was he afraid? Was he playing? Historians still argue whether those ambiguous lines were confessions, fantasies, or clever tricks to outwit the censors. Maybe, for the writer, it didn't matter. The ambiguity itself was the freedom. The best poets of the age understood the power of suggestion. You might find a friendship described in language so extravagant it would make modern lovers blush. In some cases, the intensity of feeling, aching for a glance, despairing at separation, celebrating the joy of reunion, points to something more than mere camaraderie. "He was my life's light," writes one troubadour of his chosen companion. You smile, recognizing the code. No rainbow flags, no hashtags, just poetry, curling around the truth like ivy around a crumbling castle wall. It wasn't just the poets either. The stories people told each other by firelight, the songs sung during long winter nights, the tales whispered in the kitchens and the cloisters, all carried traces of hidden love. Sometimes it's as simple as a folk song about two girls who run away together, or a legend about a prince whose heart is never won by any princess. You can almost imagine the smile on the face of the storyteller, watching to see who catches the meaning, who looks away, and who lingers just a moment too long. Not that any of this was safe, of course. If you were caught writing the wrong kind of poem, or even just found with a letter that seemed suspiciously emotional, you could find yourself summoned before a stern-faced bishop. Explain yourself, they'd demand, and you'd have to think fast. Sometimes a well-placed metaphor could save your skin. It's just a story, Your Grace, nothing but fancy. But everyone knew, even then, that stories mattered. They shaped hearts and minds, slipped past the guards of the soul. You remember the tale of Richard de Forneval, a 13th century scholar who wrote The Bestiary of Love. It's a strange little book, mixing animal facts with musings on desire, and tucked away in its pages are riddles about who may love whom. At one point, he wonders if love is more powerful than a lion, or more subtle than a fox. You think about the cleverness of hiding a question inside a metaphor about badgers and otters. Did Forneval have secrets of his own? Or was he simply reflecting the world around him, where no one could speak plainly? Here's a quirky tidbit. The medieval love letter was sometimes delivered by trained messenger pigeons. Imagine that. Risking your heart and your freedom, only for your note to be intercepted by a particularly nosy bird. You wonder how many confessions were lost to hungry cats or ended up in the wrong lap. Still, people kept writing. There's something beautifully stubborn about that. The ambiguity of medieval writing goes beyond words. You see it in the art, the way certain figures are always just close enough to be intimate, never quite crossing the line into anything you could accuse. It's as if the whole culture is winking at you, inviting you to read between the lines. Sometimes, you wonder if the church authorities knew what was going on, and simply chose to ignore it, so long as nothing was too obvious. You laugh quietly at the thought of medieval literary critics sitting around debating whether a particular poem is just very friendly or dangerously suggestive. In some ways, nothing's changed. People are still arguing about what words really mean centuries later. Maybe one day your own diary entries will be dusted off and dissected by earnest grad students. Note the ambiguity here, they'll say, nodding sagely. You'd better leave a few good riddles for them. But beneath the surface playfulness, there's always risk. A wrong word, a line taken out of context, and everything could fall apart. That's why so many stories end with heartbreak or exile. The happy endings are the ones left unwritten, the longing left unresolved. It's the kind of thing that keeps you awake at night, spinning stories in your own head because you can't speak them aloud. You picture yourself, quill in hand, about to write a letter to someone who makes your heart ache. Do you use their name? Do you dare? You settle for a nickname, a phrase only the two of you understand. Even so, your hand shakes. The risk is real. You tuck the letter inside a book, hide it beneath a loose stone, or trust it to a friend with careful instructions. If anything happens to me, burn this. Please. It's a strange comfort, knowing you're not the only one. Still, you find ways to laugh. You trade jokes about forbidden poems, about the scribe who writes beloved in 3 different inks so no one knows for sure who's being addressed. You make up outrageous stories to cover your tracks. Oh, that sonnet! It's about the Virgin Mary, obviously. If you say it with a straight face, sometimes people believe you. Sometimes they pretend to. There are stories, too, of those who tried to push the boundaries a little further. A noblewoman who hosted poetry salons where the wine flowed and the rules were a little looser. A travelling bard who delighted in tales of love that didn't quite fit the usual mould. Some say these gatherings were simply artistic. Others whisper that they were more secret parties, places where you could dance with whom you pleased, if only for a few hours. But sometimes, the evidence is right there in black and white. A song from the 14th century France describes 2 men who pledge undying loyalty until death parts us. A letter from a nun to her dearest companion survives, its closing line so tender you have to read it twice. If I could hold your hand tonight, I would not fear the morning. You imagine her sitting alone in a stone cell writing by moonlight, heart split between duty and desire. All of this, the poems, the songs, the coded letters, forms a patchwork history, more honest than any official chronicle. It's a reminder that love finds its way, even when the world is against it. You look around your quiet room and feel the weight of all those unsaid words stretching back across the centuries. They're with you now, gentle as the turning of a page. Sometimes you wonder what would have happened if people could have spoken openly. Would the stories be brighter, the endings happier, or would the danger have been even greater, the punishments more severe? Historians still argue whether the secrecy was a kind of shield or simply another burden. You sigh, knowing there's no answer, only the stories, half hidden, waiting to be found. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you find yourself humming a tune you half remember, the melody sweet and a little sad. It's easy to imagine someone else long ago humming the same tune, lost in thought about a love they could never name. You feel a kinship with them, a thread connecting you across time. Maybe, in some quiet way, you're keeping their story alive. You smile, remembering a line from an old poem. Let our love be the echo in the hall, the shadow on the stair, the word left unwritten. You think about the monks, the bards, the scribes who poured out their hearts in secret, hoping that someone, somewhere would understand. You do, you always have. The world outside is dark and silent, but inside your mind is full of songs and stories, promises whispered between the lines. Tomorrow you'll play your part again, smile at the neighbours, nod at the priest, pretend not to notice the glances, but for now you're safe here, wrapped in the words of those who came before you, each syllable a small act of defiance, a quiet hope that someday, somehow, the silence will break. Tonight, the air inside your little room feels even heavier, thick with the memory of everything you cannot say. Your candle gutters low, the shadows on the wall stretch and shiver, and outside the cathedral bell marks another hour lost to secrets. But if you close your eyes and listen, past the distant voices and the shush of the wind, you'll catch another kind of silence, the hushed rhythm of monastery life, where rules are strict, routines are eternal, and desires are meant to dissolve like chalk dust on a slate. Except, of course, they never do. Monasteries and convents are supposed to be sanctuaries, places where the world's noise is muffled and the soul can be shaped into something pure and holy. At least that's what the church proclaims from its marble pulpit. You know better. These stone sanctuaries tucked away on the misty edge of town or deep in the woods are also prisons of longing, echoing with footsteps that are never quite alone. You hear it in the way two novices pause beside the cloister garden, their heads bowed close together. You see it in the stolen glances during morning prayers, the gentle touch as a brother tends to another's wound, the smile exchanged behind a veil in the laundry room. You don't have to look hard to find stories, quiet, persistent rumours, about same-sex love blossoming inside these supposedly chaste walls. Some are tragic, some comic, some simply ordinary. And why wouldn't they be? Human beings, stripped of distraction, pressed close by ritual and routine, are bound to notice the warmth of another soul beside them. It's only natural, you think, though the rules insist otherwise. Officially, of course, the rule was clear: no particular friendships. You laugh at the phrase, so bland it could almost be a recipe ingredient. Watch out for the stew tonight. It's heavy on particular friendship. But everyone knew what it meant. If two nuns spent too much time together, if a monk's eyes lingered too long, trouble was sure to follow. The abbess or prior would issue warnings, sometimes separate the offenders, and in some cases mete out punishment that stung worse than any hair shirt or midnight fast. Yet, the rules did little to stifle longing. Take the story of Brother Alan and Brother Henry, whispered by candlelight long after the officials had gone to sleep. The two young monks arrived at the abbey within weeks of each other, both assigned to the scriptorium, both quick to laugh and slower to judge. Their bond was immediate, a friendship that deepened through hours spent copying sacred texts, heads bent close as their hands brushed over parchment and ink. Other brothers noticed. Someone joked about how often their robes trailed after one another. When their laughter echoed a little too long through the library, the prior frowned and had them separated. But still, at night, you might find them in the garden, talking softly beneath the apple trees, sharing fears no one else would ever hear. Were they in love, or simply lonely? The records never say. That's the thing. Most monastic chronicles are scrubbed clean, the secrets carefully erased by the next hand on the quill. Still, sometimes, you find a letter or a prayer where the affection is so plain you can't help but smile. Lord, grant that I may see my friend's face in heaven, writes one monk, as though that longing itself were a kind of worship. The medieval world was obsessed with regulating bodies, but it could never quite pin down the soul. Even as abbeys and priories multiplied rules, no touching after sunset, no sharing a bed, even in winter, no sitting together without a witness, the heart found ways to slip between the lines. You remember the odd rule at the great abbey of Cluny, which forbade monks from passing notes. Yes, notes. Imagine living in a world where your greatest crime is sneaking your friend a doodle of a cat and heart, carefully hidden between psalm verses. It's not just men either. In women's convents, the dangers and joys were doubled by isolation. For many girls sent to live as nuns by families eager for a respectable daughter or one less mouth to feed, the convent was both a cage and a refuge. Here, far from the eyes of fathers, husbands and priests, women forged bonds that sometimes grew deeper than blood. Spiritual friendship was the phrase most often used, and it covered a multitude of feelings. A letter from Hildegard of Bingen to a fellow nun runs hot and cold, pious one moment, fiercely adoring the next. "You are my mirror," she writes, "in whom I see my soul." That's not exactly the sort of language you find in a church handbook. You think about the medieval belief in soul friends, anamkara, as the Irish called it. These friendships, usually described as pure and spiritual, sometimes read like love stories disguised in monkish robes. Two nuns promise to pray for each other's salvation. Two monks swear, in carefully inked Latin, that their souls will remain bound together beyond the grave. Sometimes you get the sense that their heaven is less about harps and angels than simply being together, somewhere no rules can reach. But it wasn't all poetry and promise. When feelings were discovered, the consequences could be devastating. There are records of monks whipped or sent away, nuns forced to fast or denied communion. In extreme cases, a woman might be locked in a cell, forbidden to speak, her only company the cold stone and her own memory. Sometimes the punishment was more subtle, a sudden transfer to another convent, a promotion to a position that kept you too busy to think. The abbey didn't need to use chains, it could just as easily separate you with silence. There's a story, passed down in the shadows of a certain English convent, about two women whose friendship was deemed too close. The prioress, fearing scandal, separated them for years. When the younger nun fell gravely ill, the older one broke every rule, slipping into her friend's cell night after night to sit beside her and sing softly. When the younger nun died, the elder was never the same. She lived as a ghost, the chronicler notes, her eyes always searching for what she had lost. No miracle here, just the everyday tragedy of hearts denied. You wonder sometimes whether the relentless rules were less about preventing sin and more about stamping out joy. Medieval authorities were certainly thorough. There are records from the Council of Aachen in the 9th century warning abbots about improper familiarity among monks. Later, church leaders grew even more anxious, drafting new rules as if spiritual decay might be hiding under every bed. Historians still argue whether these crackdowns were in response to real scandals or simply the anxious imagination of men who feared what they could not control. For all their vigilance, though, the rules never truly worked. The heart is stubborn, as any medieval scribe with a crush could tell you. Sometimes you find stories of quiet rebellion, a monk who pens a secret hymn to his friend, a nun who risks her reputation for one last smile, and sometimes, just sometimes, you find the quiet blessings of an abbot who turns a blind eye, an old nun who remembers her own youthful longings and looks the other way. Not everyone in history was a villain after all. Still, for most, secrecy was survival. You kept your feelings hidden behind layers of habit and ritual. You learned to speak in glances, to share laughter behind your sleeve, to invent 1,000 innocent reasons for being in the same place at the same time. We're working on the choir music, you'd say, or she needs help with her Latin. And perhaps in a way it was true. Love and learning were always intertwined in these stone halls. Occasionally you stumble on an even stranger story. In some medieval convents, it was not uncommon for nuns to stage elaborate wedding rituals with each other, complete with vows, rings, and feasts. The church frowned, but rarely intervened unless things got too public. Were these ceremonies acts of friendship or something more? There's a joke whispered in the cloisters. If God didn't want us to have friends, why did he make so many lonely evenings? It's the sort of humour that stings, softens, and then makes you laugh in spite of yourself. You can imagine a group of nuns in the refectory snickering over bread and cheese, one eye always on the door. Despite everything, the love found in monasteries and convents was not always a curse. Sometimes it made life bearable, even beautiful. You picture two monks walking in the garden, heads close, sharing secrets no one else will ever know. You think of a nun writing prayers for her friend, her tears dotting the parchment. In these moments, love is not a sin but a solace, a reminder that you are, after all, human. And every now and then, a piece of that love slips past the censors. In the archives of a Spanish monastery, there's a small faded drawing, a heart pierced by 2 arrows, the initials of 2 monks tangled inside. The official record says nothing. But the image remains quietly defiant, a secret handshake across the ages. As you finally settle in, your thoughts drifting between wakefulness and sleep, you feel the echo of all those hidden stories. The walls may be thick, but nothing can keep out the truth forever. In every monastery, every convent, every silent corridor, love still flickers, stubborn as a candle flame. Dawn is a rumour outside your window, just a whisper of grey behind the chimney stacks, a bird somewhere uncertain whether it's safe to sing. You turn on your side, pillow cool, mind wandering through those silent halls where secrets walk before sunrise. You think of confessions, the ones made honestly and the ones squeezed out under the hard gaze of a church court, loud enough to shatter a life. You hear them now, the measured footfall of a church scribe, the scrape of a wooden chair, the scratch of quill on parchment. The confessional for most is supposed to be a safe haven, a place to lay down your burdens and rise up clean. But if your burdens don't match the church's map of what a soul should be, the confessional can become a trap. You step inside that small, musty space with its thin partition and hope, always hope, that the priest on the other side is merciful. Sometimes he is, often he is not. For centuries, church courts didn't just police the streets, they policed your very thoughts. The system was elaborate, almost theatrical. There were public hearings, lists of forbidden acts read out loud, punishments designed to wound the soul and humiliate the body. In this world, confession wasn't just about saving yourself, it was about keeping everyone else in line. You'd see it on market days, some poor wretch, face covered, kneeling in the mud, forced to beg forgiveness for a sin that nobody would even name aloud. If you were lucky, you'd only lose your reputation. If you weren't, you'd lose much more. Historians still argue whether the church's obsession with rooting out unnatural desire came from genuine spiritual terror or a more basic urge to control the flock. Maybe it was both. What's certain is that fear worked wonders. Public punishment didn't just ruin one life, it was meant to echo through every home, every whispered conversation. You walk through the square at noon, the crowd gathered around the pillory, and everyone understands this could be you. It wasn't just about the crime, it was about the spectacle. There's a grim comedy in how detailed the records become. Who looked at whom? Who sat too close at dinner? Who exchanged gifts in secret? Sometimes the proof was laughably small. A hand held too long, a letter written in the wrong colour ink. The church courts demanded confessions, and if you couldn't provide one, they might supply it for you. Confess now, they'd say, and God will forgive. You learn to weigh each word to keep the truth as far from your lips as possible. After all, even the whisper of a rumour could turn you into an example, and yet sometimes you caught a glimpse of mercy, unexpected, fleeting. An abbot who looks away, a bishop who lets a rumour die. But most weren't so kind. You remember the story of Thomas, a baker's apprentice who confessed to loving another boy. He thought honesty would buy him forgiveness. Instead, the court paraded him through the streets, forced him to wear a shame mask, and then sent him away, exiled forever from the only town he'd ever known. His name disappears from the records after that, as if the world agreed to forget him, as if he'd never existed. But public shame was only one flavour of punishment. There were subtler cruelties too. A family that stops speaking to you, a trade guild that quietly closes its doors, a neighbour who turns away when you pass. The silence could be as sharp as any lash. You learned, quickly, to keep your heart locked up tight. It's the kind of lesson that never really fades, even centuries later. Sometimes the punishment was more than social. Some church courts prescribed penance that veered toward the theatrical, wearing sackcloth for a year, fasting until you fainted, walking barefoot to the nearest shrine. If your sin was deemed severe enough, you might find yourself sent on a distant pilgrimage, walking for months under the weight of your secrets, every step a prayer that no one back home ever learns the truth. And yet, through all this, you still saw moments of bravery. Sometimes a soul would stand before the court, voice steady, refusing to invent a story just to satisfy their judges. These moments were rare, but they happened, and when they did, the room seemed to tremble. One chronicle tells of a woman named Cecily, accused by her neighbours of forbidden affection for another woman in her village. When the bishop demanded a confession, she simply said, "Love is not a crime." The court gasped, the scribe nearly dropped his pen. They punished her, of course, but her words lingered in the air long after she'd gone. Quirky as it sounds, the medieval church was fascinated by lists. You leaf through old legal handbooks and there they are. Page after page of sins and penances, catalogued like recipes for repentance. For some, the list never seemed long enough. There were always new fears, new rumours, new things to forbid. The result was a culture always on edge, never sure where the line would be drawn next. You walk carefully, heart tucked away, smile practiced until it feels like another mask. But rules, no matter how strict, never quite manage to keep life from slipping through the cracks. You find ways to communicate, to comfort, to survive. Sometimes, you even find ways to resist. There's a story told in a German town of a group of women who, accused of unnatural friendship, refused to name each other in court. They stood together, silent, letting the judges rage. Eventually the authorities gave up. The records say only that the women would not speak. It's a small victory, but you cling to it. Confession itself was sometimes a double-edged sword. For every story of terror, there's another of unexpected gentleness. A priest who, instead of condemnation, offers counsel. Pray for wisdom, he whispers through the screen, and guard your heart. You wonder how many priests and monks, themselves burdened with forbidden desires, recognize something familiar in those confessions. Historians still argue whether compassion or hypocrisy won the day more often. The records rarely say. Of course, sometimes the church's power waned. In times of war, plague, or famine, priorities shifted. Suddenly it mattered less who you loved, and more whether you could dig a grave, harvest a field, tend the sick. There are gaps in the records, years where the courts went quiet and life, if only for a moment, became a little freer. You find yourself almost grateful for those disasters. Proof that, given enough chaos, the world forgets to police desire for a while. Still, the memory of punishment lingers. You carry it with you like a shadow, shaping every choice, every conversation. It's the reason you never quite say what you mean, never quite look for too long. There's a line from a medieval play you once heard: "The tongue must be wiser than the heart." You think about that a lot, especially when the world feels small and the air tastes of rain and regret. Not every confession was forced. Sometimes, in the privacy of a darkened room, two friends would share secrets, trusting that the other would keep silent. These whispered truths became lifelines, tying you to someone who understood. In a world so quick to judge, even a single moment of honesty was a kind of rebellion. You treasure these memories, tuck them away in the corners of your mind, proof that the heart can survive almost anything. It's odd how the rituals meant to purify could also bring comfort. The very act of confession, a hand on your shoulder, a voice murmuring forgiveness, sometimes helped you forgive yourself, if only for a little while. You wonder if that's what the church intended, or if it's just another case of people making the best of a bad situation. Historians still argue whether confession was meant to heal or to control, but you know the truth is always somewhere in between. In quieter moments, you imagine a world where confessions are met with understanding, where shame is replaced by empathy. You picture the church not as a court, but as a shelter, a place to lay down every burden. You suspect this dream was shared by many, even in the darkest times. Some clergy, saints in all but name, lived it, quietly bending the rules, letting love slip through the cracks. Their stories are hard to find, but you believe they're real. And so you move through this world wary but not hopeless. You learn to trust carefully, to love quietly, to find joy where you can. You laugh with friends, share a joke in the marketplace, savour the sweetness of a stolen moment. Sometimes, even in the midst of fear, you feel a fierce pride. You have survived, you're still here, and that is its own kind of triumph. Outside, the city is waking up. The bells call the faithful to prayer, the market stalls open, and the world resumes its relentless march. But inside you carry the memory of Cecily, of Thomas, of all those who stood before the court and refused to be erased. You carry the hope that someday confessions will be met with kindness, that shame will give way to acceptance, that love, however it comes, will no longer need to hide. You turn your head on the pillow, the early sun warm on your face. There's a line from an old prayer that drifts through your thoughts. "Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us." You wonder what the world would be like if everyone meant it. Maybe, just maybe, you think, there's a future where that prayer is finally answered. You're starting to notice a pattern now, a peculiar rhythm in the way medieval life places intimacy. The town is brightening. Somewhere the baker's cart rattles over cobbles, the first warm loaves exhaling steam into the morning air. But behind the bustle, every relationship is measured, every smile weighed for its proper place. You trudge down the main street thinking about all the tales of brotherhood and loyalty that shimmer at the edge of medieval history. The age loves to celebrate male friendship. Two men-at-arms, bound together by loyalty, defending each other to the last. Chivalry, after all, demands as much, is almost a virtue. The idea that one man might die for another, that a comrade's honour is as precious as your own. Songs are written about it, and tapestries depict it. But even this celebrated closeness comes with a warning label, especially if it strays into the forbidden territory of desire. It's here, in the half-light between friendship and something more, that gossip finds fertile soil. The feudal world is full of spaces where young men grow up together, castles, military camps, guild houses, living side by side, sometimes since childhood. Bonds run deep. There's the tale of Godfrey and Eustace, squires in the same household, inseparable as two wolf pups. People joke about them at first, calling them twins by another mother. The older knights laugh, but as the years pass and neither marries, the jokes curdle into suspicion. The medieval world does love a good rumour. You hear it in the baker's laughter, the blacksmith's raised eyebrow, the sideways glance at the bathhouse. Dangerous friendships, they say, pretending to jest but always watching. And so Godfrey and Eustace drift apart, each eventually marrying a cousin, both choosing silence over risk. Years later, at a feast, you catch them sitting together again, eyes bright with memory, the old bond flickering back to life in stolen moments. No one says a word, but everyone knows. Historians still argue whether the boundaries between friendship and desire in the Middle Ages were as clear as modern readers want to believe. In some sources, you find friendships described in language so passionate it almost burns the page. "He is my other soul," writes one knight of his companion. In others, the chronicler steps back, anxious to explain that of course nothing improper occurred. You sense the anxiety, the urgent need to separate pure brotherhood from unnatural vice, as though the mere presence of affection might be contagious. The suspicion isn't reserved for men. In market towns and villages, women's friendships also come under scrutiny. Two girls grow up together, share chores, laugh in the fields. For a while, no one minds. But if the years pass and neither seeks a husband, the whispers begin. "Perhaps she's been bewitched," the old women say. "Perhaps they're hiding something." Suddenly, every kindness is suspect, every private joke a possible clue. Some friendships survive, others are carefully pruned away, one girl married off in a hurry, the other left behind. It's a strange paradox. The culture prizes loyalty, yet punishes intimacy if it doesn't follow the script. You think about how many stories have been lost, how many jokes never told, simply because two people dare to care too much. The joke, of course, is that everyone, yes, everyone, has something to hide. Even the king sitting atop his gilded throne has secrets tucked beneath his ermine robe. One of the most peculiar fringe tidbits you hear about is the medieval brotherhood oath. In some corners of Europe, young men pledged loyalty to one another in ceremonies that were almost indistinguishable from marriage rites. They exchanged tokens, sometimes even slept side by side as a sign of their bond. Local priests presided over the rituals, blessing the friendship and praying for its endurance. For centuries, these ceremonies were taken for granted, celebrated as proof of chivalric devotion. But then, attitudes shift. The same ceremonies once admired are now eyed with suspicion. "Why such loyalty?" the bishops ask. "What are you hiding?" Slowly the old oaths fade, replaced by warier rituals, friendships confined to daylight and duty. You think about the power of gossip in a world like this. It's not the formal trials or punishments that hurt most, but the constant low-level hum of judgment. You learn to measure your words, to keep your laughter quiet, to check your hand before it strays too close. Sometimes, a friendship simply dissolves under the weight of too many sideways glances. You find yourself walking alone more often, telling yourself you prefer it that way. There's an old proverb in your town, "A shared secret is half a burden." But you're never quite sure if that's true. Sharing can be dangerous. Even the smallest slip, a careless joke, a gift exchanged in the wrong company, can spark a fire of suspicion. You remember the story of Marjorie and Alice, two girls who exchanged carved combs as a promise to always stay friends. One day, a neighbour saw Alice kiss Marjorie on the cheek, and suddenly the whole street buzzed with speculation. Their families pulled them apart, forbade them to meet. Years later, the combs are still hidden at the bottom of each girl's hope chest, bittersweet relics of what was lost. You see how these suspicions twist through every level of society. Even within families, parents watch their children closely, intervening at the first hint of strange behaviour. Apprentices are warned to keep their distance. Serving girls are scolded for spending too much time together after dark. The lesson's clear. Desire, even in its gentlest form, must be corralled, controlled, kept safely within the bounds of marriage, or not at all. Yet despite the scrutiny, you can't help but marvel at the persistence of real friendship. It slips through the cracks, blooms in hidden corners, sometimes disguised as rivalry, sometimes as fierce loyalty. You remember the tale of the two knights who fought side by side for years, their bond so famous that poets wrote songs about them. When one died, the other ordered a monument built, their names entwined in stone. No one dared to ask what their last words were. Historians still argue whether these famous friendships were romantic, platonic, or something in between. The records are maddeningly vague, perhaps deliberately so. Chroniclers, keenly aware of the dangers, tread carefully. They praise loyalty and devotion, but never linger too long on what might lie beneath. You wonder what would happen if they'd simply told the truth, if the world had been brave enough to name what it saw. Of course, there are places where the rules are looser, the suspicion less keen. In bustling port cities or the remote borderlands, life is less tightly controlled. Here, people are too busy to pry, and friendships flourish in a little more daylight. You hear stories of sailors who form marriage brotherhoods, promising to care for each other's families should one be lost at sea. The church frowns, but the city shrugs. There are too many other secrets to worry about. Still, you know that even here, the old fear lingers. One wrong word, one enemy, and all the protection in the world can vanish. You think of how exhausting it must have been. Always checking, always worrying. It's a kind of slow erosion. The way suspicion eats at trust, the way it wears down even the strongest bonds. Sometimes, though, the world surprises you. You hear about an old knight who, after a long life, gives away his estate, not to his distant relatives, but to his lifelong companion. The family grumbles, but the village understands. They were closer than brothers, they say. The church raises an eyebrow, but lets it pass. Perhaps in the end, affection is stronger than fear. And yet, you can't shake the sadness, the sense of so many lost stories, so many friendships cut short or driven underground. You imagine all the things never said, the embraces stolen in dark corners, the laughter muffled by caution. You wonder what it would be like to live in a world where friendship, real, deep, complicated friendship, could bloom without fear. As the day brightens, you feel both hopeful and heavy. There is joy in remembering the love that survived, but grief for everything that didn't. You think of all the times you've held back, all the times you chose silence over honesty. You wonder if the world will ever change, if the day will come when a hand on a friend's shoulder means only what it means, nothing more, nothing less. In the end, you know this. No rule, no rumour, no court can truly destroy what is human. Friendship, love, desire, they endure. They twist and turn, adapt and survive, slipping through the cracks like grass through stone. You take comfort in that, in the stubbornness of the heart, in the way joy finds its way, even in the most unlikely places. Outside, the market is alive now, the square filling with voices and laughter. You rise from your bed, stretch, and face the day. The world will watch, as it always does. But for now you remember every story, every friendship, every dangerous, precious bond. You carry them with you, tucked safe inside, a quiet rebellion against suspicion, a promise that nothing truly loved is ever lost. You walk now beneath the clatter and gossip of the marketplace, where every gesture is a language and every language a labyrinth. The crowds swirl. Fishmongers shout, children dart between skirts, a flock of geese makes dignified progress past the apothecary's stall. You realise that in a world of suspicion, sometimes the only way to survive is to master the art of hiding in plain sight. You blend in, but you never truly belong. If desire is a secret, then secrecy itself becomes second nature. Here's where the subtlety of the queer medieval world becomes almost an art form. If you are to survive, you must learn how to signal and how to mask. You keep your voice low, your glances fleeting, your laughter just quiet enough that no one thinks you're too happy. But for those with eyes to see and hearts that recognize the invisible, there is another layer beneath the surface. This is the world of secret symbols, private gestures, and coded communication. A world where meaning is rarely spoken but often understood. Historians still argue whether there really was a formal language of queer medieval life, whether certain jewellery, flowers or colours held a special meaning, or if that's just a modern wish projected backwards. Yet, scattered through chronicles and old ballads, you do find hints. An emblem stitched on a sleeve, a flower pressed inside a prayer book, Two candles set close together in a chapel window. Each detail might be innocent, but stacked together, they become a conversation hidden from all but the intended. You notice the way a baker ties a blue ribbon around a loaf, said in some towns to be a sign of longing for unusual company. Or how a pair of friends always trade sprigs of rosemary after Mass, lingering in the doorway, heads inclined. Sometimes the code is as simple as a shared joke. You like your bread a little darker, don't you? And sometimes it's a look that lingers a breath longer than it should. You become fluent in ambiguity, careful in everything you say and do. There are other symbols too tucked into daily life. In some cities it's rumoured that men with a fondness for violet or blue dyes are of a different sort. A little frivolous? Maybe. But when your whole world is designed to catch you out, the smallest defiance feels enormous. You find yourself drawn to certain saints' days, Cecilia for musicians, Sebastian for soldiers, where the prayers are fervent, the company suspiciously close. The church, with all its saints and relics, unwittingly provides cover for every kind of coded affection. Sebastian in particular, depicted as beautiful, pierced with arrows, beloved by artists, gathers a quiet, almost rebellious cult of admirers. Is it faith? Is it longing? Is it both? You smile at the ambiguity, grateful for the shelter it provides. Some of the codes are built into the rhythm of daily life. In the laundry, women fold sheets in a particular pattern, a way of saying, I see you, I know. In the stables, a groom brushes a horse in silence while another hums an old love song just loud enough to be heard. The markets themselves become stages, places to meet, to slip notes, to pass a token that means, I remember. You catch the scent of rosemary and lavender, herbs with old reputations, and smile, knowing they mean more than simply freshening up the laundry. You learn quickly that symbols can protect as well as endanger. One wrong flower, one mistaken gesture, and you risk not just embarrassment, but real danger. There's the story of a merchant's son in Rouen who wore a violet pin to the midsummer fair, thinking it marked him as discreet and desirable. Instead, he drew the attention of a town gossip, and soon he found himself summoned before the bishop. He claimed ignorance, I just liked the colour, and managed to escape punishment but never wore the pin again. Not all codes are visual. Language itself becomes a tool of survival. You hear the careful way people phrase things. Never my lover, always my friend. Never I long for him, always I wish him well. Sometimes words slip, someone says too much or not enough, and there's a sharp intake of breath, a pause and then a swift recovery. The stakes are high, but so is the thrill. You feel alive, alert, aware of every nuance. Even art becomes a code. You linger by the church murals, tracing the lines of saints who stand just a little too close, angels whose gazes meet with something like longing. The artists themselves, half forgotten, often anonymous, find ways to smuggle desire into their work. A hand rests on a shoulder, a halo tilts in sympathy. A pair of doves perched together on a branch side by side. Most viewers see only piety. You see 1,000 stories just below the surface. Sometimes you're not even sure if the codes are real or just something you desperately want to believe in. There's comfort in the possibility. Comfort in thinking that, across centuries, someone like you found a way to speak in silence, to reach out in secret. You wonder if the people of your time will someday look back and find symbols in your own life, meanings you never intended but needed all the same. Quirky as it may sound, medieval fairs sometimes became informal gatherings for those of a different mind. The crowded anonymity of the festival, the masks and costumes, the surging, shifting crowds, all allowed for risk and for opportunity. Two men disguised as jesters slip away behind a tent. Two women, faces hidden beneath garlands of ivy, hold hands while watching the puppet show. For one night at least, everyone is playing a part and you can be someone else. Or perhaps just yourself. Historians still argue whether these fairs and festivals were genuinely more permissive, or if that's simply the dream of outsiders looking for cracks in the wall. Maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is that, in the swirl of music and laughter, for a moment you feel the weight of secrecy lift, replaced by something that almost feels like belonging. And then, just as quickly, the mask slips back on. The world outside the fair is as rigid as ever. You hide your tokens, keep your language neutral, remember not to meet anyone's gaze for too long. But you tuck those moments away, savour them, store them up for the long nights when it feels like no one sees you at all. Even the church, with all its scrutiny, cannot entirely crush the human need for connection. You remember hearing a priest once who delivered a sermon so vague that no one was sure who he was warning. Beware those who seek too much company, beware those who walk together too often, and then watched as the congregation looked at each other, measuring, wondering, choosing to see or not see as it suited them. You think about how much energy is spent decoding and recoding, how tiring it must be to constantly monitor every word, every glance, every gesture. You find yourself wishing just once to be careless, to let a laugh ring out without fear. But until that day comes, you become an expert in the unsaid. Sometimes you laugh about it with friends, inventing new codes just for fun. If I wear green tomorrow, it means meet me by the mill. If I braid my hair with red thread, it means I'm thinking of you. The game is half serious, half desperate, but always necessary. You are building a secret language, not because you want to, but because the world gives you no other choice. Not every attempt at coded communication succeeds. There's the famous fiasco of a guild apprentice who, trying to declare his affection for another, carved a heart into a loaf of bread. The bread was confiscated and shown to the entire guild as a warning. Idle hands breed trouble. No one was punished, but the apprentice never baked another heart. Still, those who understood remembered. The story became a quiet joke, a reminder that love, like bread, can't be hidden forever. Symbols can sometimes backfire. You think of the story of a young nun who embroidered her handkerchief with blue and gold thread, the colours of her friend's family crest. The prioress noticed, and for weeks the convent was gripped by whispers. The two nuns were separated, sent to different abbeys for their spiritual health. The handkerchief disappeared, but years later, when the older nun died, her companion found it hidden beneath her pillow. A silent reunion, a victory against the rules. Through all of this, the signals, the symbols, the secret languages, you realise that every attempt to connect is an act of hope. The world may demand silence, but you answer with whispers, with glances, with rosemary pressed between the pages of a prayer book. You create meaning, invent rituals, carve space for yourself in a world that tries so hard to erase you. Historians will never agree on what all the codes meant, on whether blue ribbons or violets, or certain phrases carried the weight of confession or were simply coincidence. Maybe that's the beauty of it, the uncertainty, the sense of endless possibility. You look at your own life, at the little tokens you keep, the words you dare not say, and know you're part of a much older story. As the day winds on, the marketplace ebbs and flows, but beneath it all, the quiet currents of secret communication continue. A nod, a laugh, a hand resting lightly on an arm. None of it conclusive, all of it necessary. You are here, you are seen, if only by those who know how to look. In this world of suspicion and silence, you become an artist, a spy, a poet. Every day is a performance, every word a gamble. And still, you endure. You learn to treasure the language of the unsaid, to find joy in the game, to turn secrecy itself into a kind of freedom. For now, that is enough. Evening returns, slow and golden, draping every rooftop and cobblestone in honeyed light. You slip through narrow lanes as the sun retreats behind cathedral towers, the warmth on your back giving way to cool shadow. By now you know this is a time when the rules seem to loosen, when secrets become bolder, laughter floats a little freer, and the city's hidden currents swirl strongest. But tonight, in your quiet walk, you sense a deeper chill, the fear that always trails queer desire, especially in times of crisis. It's a fear that is almost ritual, as old as the ringing of church bells, blaming the outsider, looking for someone to carry society's anxieties and sins. You see it in the faces of those huddled at the edge of the market, the newcomers, the travellers, the ones who speak with unfamiliar accents or wear their hair a shade too long or short. You see it in the way townsfolk circle their wagons when the world grows dangerous. War, plague, famine. When these strike, people look for a cause, and someone always has to pay. In this medieval world, queer desire is one of many convenient scapegoats. The pattern is as familiar as it is unjust. The priest thunders from his pulpit that God's anger is provoked by unnatural sin. He doesn't name names, but the message is clear. The baker's wife, eyeing her sick child, repeats the warning in hushed tones. By the next morning, suspicion spreads through the lanes like fire in dry straw. Someone, anyone, must be blamed. The outsider, the quiet one, the woman who never married, the man who laughs a bit too loudly with his friends. They are watched, whispered about, sometimes accused outright. You understand the terror in their eyes, the calculation in their every step. This foreignness becomes a weapon, sharpened whenever the town needs a culprit. Sometimes it's strangers from distant cities. Sometimes it's the neighbours you've known for years, suddenly cast as corrupt or different for reasons no one can quite define. You think of the old Jewish quarter, walled off and watched, blamed for everything from drought to disease. The same stories are told about travelling minstrels, wandering craftsmen, and anyone whose desires do not match the local script. It's not just fear of outsiders. Sometimes suspicion is aimed inward, at the young, the unmarried, the odd. A boy caught alone with a friend is accused of learning foreign ways. A woman who lives with her companion is said to be under strange influence. The labels shift, but the suspicion stays the same. You realise with a bitter smile that in the end no one is truly safe. The community's need for control is insatiable. Difference itself is the crime. You see the cycle play out every time disaster strikes. The chronicler's ink is heavy with accusations, after the Black Death, after a failed harvest, after a military defeat. There is always a litany of new laws, new sermons, new promises that rooting out unnatural acts will restore order. Sometimes these crackdowns are laughably ineffective. You read about one mayor who posted guards outside the city baths to prevent sinful company. The guards naturally took bribes and joined the bathers themselves. The crackdown faded, but the fear lingered. One of the most peculiar tidbits you come across is the medieval obsession with sumptuary laws. Rules about what people could wear, what fabrics they could use, what colours they could show in public. Ostensibly about class and piety, these laws were also used to target those suspected of deviance or difference. A man caught in silk might be called effeminate and fined. A woman who dressed plainly but walked with another woman might be suspected of hiding corruption. The connection between clothing and desire was rarely spelled out, but everyone understood the threat. Don't stand out, don't be different, or risk being marked as an outsider. It's not just the officials who do the blaming. Ordinary people can be just as quick to protect themselves by turning on their neighbours. You recall the case of a small village where, after a string of mysterious fires, a young man known for his peculiar friendships was accused of sorcery. There was no evidence, but the town needed a reason, and he was the easiest target. He disappeared one night. Some say he fled, others say he was sent away for his own safety. The fires stopped, but so did the laughter in his parents' home. The need to blame to find a scapegoat is so deeply ingrained that it becomes a kind of folklore. You hear it in the bedtime stories mothers tell. Beware the witch, beware the stranger, beware the one who walks alone. You see it in the faces that look away when trouble brews, in the children taught to point fingers before they can write their own names. It's a form of magic, you think. This power to turn fear into law, suspicion into punishment. Yet, through it all, you notice that even those who accuse are never truly certain. There's always a sliver of doubt, a hesitation in the eyes, as if everyone knows the real danger is not indifference, but in the lies we tell to feel safe. You wonder how many accusations were made out of guilt, how many people, suspecting their own desires, tried to erase them by condemning others. Historians still argue whether the great purges of certain cities, the public burnings, the exiles, the mass confessions, were driven by genuine panic or by leaders using fear to tighten their grip. You suspect it was both. Fear is a powerful tool, but it needs fuel. A good rumour, a convenient enemy, and the town falls in line. You remember the story of a bishop who, caught in his own scandal, diverted attention by accusing 3 local deviants. The bishop kept his seat. The accused lost everything. Some towns try to legislate difference out of existence. You see it in the city ordinances. No man shall walk with another after sunset. No woman may visit her friend's home without a male chaperone. No foreigner may stay more than 3 nights. The records are full of these rules, rarely enforced, often ignored but always present, a background hum of suspicion. You can't help but laugh sometimes at how transparent the anxiety is. The more rules they make, the more certain you become that they are afraid of their own weakness, their own longing, their own capacity for difference. The world pretends to be strong, but you see the cracks in every law, every sermon, every hurried whisper. Through all this, queer desire is painted as something foreign, something brought in by strangers, something never truly native to the soil. It's a lie, of course, but a useful one. As long as the danger is elsewhere, the town can feel safe. But you know better. Desire, after all, needs no passport. Oddly enough, this foreignness sometimes becomes a source of comfort. In the port cities, the borderlands, the trading posts where people come and go, you find pockets of freedom. Here, outsiders gather not just because they have to, but because they want to. Here, the suspicion is still present, but it is tempered by necessity. You hear of taverns where men and women dance together in whatever pairings they wish, where old rules are bent or ignored for a night. For some, these are the only places where desire is allowed to breathe. Even in these spaces, though, you are reminded that safety is always fragile. A single word, a single angry customer, and the atmosphere shifts. You are always on guard, always watching for the moment the crowd decides it needs another scapegoat. You think about what it means to be blamed for the world's misfortune. You feel the weight of it, a burden passed down, never chosen, but always inherited. It shapes the way you move, the way you speak, the way you love. It makes you cautious, yes, but also stubborn. If you survive, you do so not by erasing yourself, but by learning to live within the boundaries, to bend without breaking, to find community in the cracks. There is a kind of solidarity, a quiet resistance that grows out of being blamed. You recognize it in the small gestures. A loaf of bread left on a doorstep, a candle lit in a hidden window, a note tucked inside a prayer book. You find others who know what it means to be accused, and together you build a world that is not safe, but is at least yours. Sometimes, in the long hours after sunset, you let yourself hope for more. You imagine a world where difference is not a crime, where the outsider is welcomed, where blame is replaced by understanding. You know it is a distant dream, but in the warmth of shared laughter, in the hush of secret conversation, you catch a glimpse of what might be. For now, you walk quietly, eyes open, heart cautious but unbroken. The night is dark, but you're not alone. In every town, in every age, there are those who survive the blame, who endure, who refuse to be erased. You carry their memory with you, a lantern against the darkness, a promise that, despite everything, the story is not over. Tonight the town seems quieter. The sky a deep well of blue, only a faint gold edging the western rooftops. You linger by a shuttered window, the air scented with spent fires and late-blooming herbs, your thoughts drifting to all the secrets people tried to hide, and all the evidence they couldn't quite bear to destroy. In a world where queer desire was buried in shame, love itself became the most dangerous artifact. The evidence was hidden in the smallest things: a crumpled letter, a pressed flower, a page torn hastily from a diary. Most were burned, but a few survived, carrying fragile traces of lives the world tried to erase. You imagine the hands that held those letters, the care with which they were written, a trembling quill, a flicker of hope, sometimes reckless, sometimes desperate. Every word risked discovery, every name could mean ruin. You picture the lovers whose stories lie silent between the lines of chronicles, whose voices are barely audible beneath the grand sermons and the endless records of laws broken and punishments given. Historians still argue whether any truly honest love letters survived, or if every last one ended in fire or mud, or the bottom of a well. But sometimes one slips through. Take the story of Isabel and Agnes, two women from the southern hills who grew up together, weaving garlands for festival days and sharing every secret except the most important one. When they were old enough, each was married off, one to a shepherd, one to a merchant, but their friendship endured. They met in the orchard behind Agnes's house, exchanged notes written on scraps of linen, buried treasures in the roots of the oldest tree. One letter, miraculously found centuries later, stitched into the lining of a forgotten dress, reads simply, "If I could unmake the world and build it again, I would make a place just for us." The rest is silence. There are hundreds of stories like theirs, most half-remembered, most ending abruptly with a burned page or an empty chest. You can almost hear the quick breath as a footstep sounds on the stair, the trembling hands as a secret is hidden away. Sometimes the evidence is destroyed before it can even become a memory. A diary burned the morning after it is written, a love token thrown into the river, a poem copied and then torn to shreds. Safer to forget, the old proverb says. Safer perhaps, but infinitely sadder. You think of all the archives where scholars dig, hoping for a clue, a signature, a coded phrase, a blot of ink in the right corner. Sometimes a miracle happens. A bundle of letters hidden in a wall, a journal stuffed into the eaves of a church, a ring engraved with two names that never appear together in any official record. Most often, though, you find only fragments. A line of verse, a date, an unexplained gap in a monk's otherwise meticulous accounting of days is not just letters either. In a world that loves records, silence itself becomes suspicious. Why did Sister Magdalene suddenly disappear from the convent? Why did Master Hughes leave town in the middle of Lent? The gaps become as telling as any confession. In the records you find the absences, names crossed out, pages missing, accounts that trail off just as they get interesting. Historians still argue whether these were accidents or acts of deliberate forgetting, you remind yourself, reading between the lines. One of the oddest, saddest tidbits you stumble across is the medieval habit of burning not just love letters, but the belongings of anyone who died under suspicion. Their clothes, books, sometimes even the bed itself, destroyed to purify the home, to drive out the memory. It's a strange, grim ritual, and you wonder what good it really did. After all, you can burn a blanket, but how do you burn a story? How do you unwrite a memory? You imagine the midnight burnings, a handful of friends gathered quietly in a backyard or at the edge of the woods, feeding the fire with words and tokens, watching as the flames erase everything that mattered most. There's a kind of dark magic in it, the idea that by destroying evidence you can protect the living. But you know that for every letter burned, there are 100 memories carried in hearts and whispered in kitchens, passed down through generations in the language of glances and unfinished sentences. Sometimes the effort to erase only makes the memory sharper. There's the story of a troubadour in Toulouse who, forbidden from seeing his beloved, wrote a final song and sang it in the square at dawn. By noon, the lyrics were on every tongue. The church tried to ban the song, but it was too late. People sang it in secret long after the original words were forgotten, the melody carrying the trace of a love that would not die. The need to destroy evidence was always a contest against time. Some letters were so carefully hidden they were never found at all, only rediscovered centuries later by accident. A hollow beam in a merchant's house, a knot in the stonework of a convent, a bundle of parchment stuffed into the heel of a pilgrim's shoe. every so often you hear of a new discovery, a faded heart, two names twined together, a plea for forgiveness, a line of poetry so raw and honest it makes you catch your breath. But for every survivor, there are 1,000 lost. You mourn them, even as you celebrate the ones that remain. The world tried so hard to erase queer love, but the record is stubborn. A burnt page leaves ashes, and ashes sometimes tell their own story. You wonder what the world would look like if all those letters had survived. Imagine the archives, shelves and shelves of confessions, endearments, inside jokes, dreams scribbled in the margins. Imagine being able to read, in their own words, how people loved, how they risked, how they grieved. You think the story of the Middle Ages would feel different, less grim, more human, alive with hope as well as fear. Still, there is something powerful in the fragments. A single letter, a line of verse, can stand against centuries of silence. You remember the old tale of a village priest who, upon discovering a bundle of suspicious letters, chose not to burn them, but to hide them deeper. "Let no one read them until the world is kinder," he wrote in the parish book. The letters were never found, but the notes survived. You wonder if they are still waiting somewhere in the dust and darkness for someone brave enough to open them. Historians still argue whether the stories we find are true portraits or just wishful thinking, romanticizing scraps and clues because we need them to mean more than they do. But you know the longing is real. Even if the stories are incomplete, even if most of the evidence is lost, the yearning remains. The wish that someone, somewhere, remembered, that someone cared enough to keep even a scrap. You picture yourself hunched over a candle, writing your own letter, not to a lover, but to the future. "We were here," you say in your mind. "We loved, we dreamed. Remember us." The candle flickers, the sky deepens, and you feel a kinship with every hand that wrote, every eye that scanned the darkness for a safe place to hide a note. There is a kind of courage in every act of erasure. To risk writing a letter, knowing it might have to be destroyed. To love, knowing the world may never know your name. To trust someone enough to hand them your heart, even if they must bury it for safety. You think of all the unnamed lovers, all the stories lost to fire and fear, and feel a fierce pride on their behalf. You tried, you whisper. You lived, even when living meant erasing yourself. And sometimes you are rewarded. In the archive of a small city, you find a love poem scribbled in the margin of a legal document. "More precious to me than gold is the sound of your voice." The lawyer who wrote it is lost to history, but the words survive. In a forgotten graveyard, two stones stand side by side, marked only with initials and a date. No one knows who they were, but the stones remain silent witnesses to a bond the world could not name. In the end, you know the burning of letters and diaries did not truly destroy the past. The love survived, in memory, in rumour, in the echo of a song sung quietly in the dark. You turn from the window, the night deep around you, and realise you are part of that long chain of memory, a witness to what could not be erased. You settle into your bed, the world outside hushed, your mind alive with stories half told and letters half burned. Tomorrow, the sun will rise on a town that believes it has buried its shame, but you know the truth. The past is never truly lost. Every word, every hope, every love, it lingers, waiting to be found. You breathe out, slow and steady, letting the hush of midnight fill your room, a room not much different perhaps from the ones where all those stories once happened. Tonight, you listened for the words that never made it into any archive, the confessions that slipped past even the most watchful eyes. In the great machinery of medieval shame, the thing that is most feared, the thing that is always, always just out of reach, is the naming of the sin itself. You notice how the language twists and knots, refusing to say what it means, hiding desire beneath layers of euphemism and dread. You wander through centuries of records, court rolls, church edicts, chronicles thick with warnings and accusations, and you see it again and again. A deliberate vagueness, a refusal to look queer love in the eye. The vice unnamed, they call it, the sin against nature. The crime too foul for Christian lips. Historians still argue whether this was strategic, a way for the church and state to control the conversation, or simply a reflection of their own discomfort, a kind of collective averting of the eyes. You think of the old trial documents. He did acts not to be spoken. She consorted with her companion in a manner unfit for Christian womanhood. No detail, no description, only the chilling certainty that whatever happened, it must not be described. It's as if to name it would be to make it real, to invite it, like a ghost, into the light of day. You find this almost comical in a way. The entire world in a state of alarm over something it cannot even say out loud. But you also know how terrifying this vagueness can be. When no one is willing to define the line, anything can be made to cross it. Desire becomes a kind of fog, unseen but dangerous and impossible to defend against. If you are accused, you have nothing to argue with. If you are feared, you have nothing to disprove. The sin without name is a moving target, able to shift with every suspicion, every rumour, every uneasy glance. This strategy of silence works both ways. It is used by the powerful to maintain control, but also by those who wish to survive. You think of all the people who live double lives, their love unnamed, their desires coded in stories or folded into the language of piety and friendship. They learned how to slip between words, how to express devotion in ways that drew no attention. You hear the voices in old letters, always just on the edge of saying too much. I pray for your health every night, one nun writes to another. May we always remain in God's grace together. The words mean everything, and nothing, safe on the surface, boundless beneath. You marvel at how skillful people became at hiding in plain sight. There are songs and stories from the period that seem to be about nothing at all. Two friends separated by fate, a hero who cannot be with his dearest companion, a woman who leaves her family for the love of freedom. Only by reading between the lines do you see what is really at stake. You imagine those first audiences listening with their own secrets, hearing the message behind the mask. And yet, there are always risks. Sometimes the fog lifts and accusation comes swift and sharp. In one infamous case from a small Italian city, a group of young men are brought before the bishop, accused of foul practices. The court record is maddeningly vague. They gathered together after dark. They did as ought not be done. No specifics are offered, but the punishment is severe. Public penance, exile, and the burning of all their possessions. Their names vanish from the rolls, as if that were enough to erase their lives. There's something grimly comical about the church's refusal to speak plainly. You picture an entire courtroom dancing around the truth, everyone nodding gravely while pretending not to know what they're talking about. Let us not name the evil, lest it multiply. It's almost as if, by never defining it, they hoped it would disappear. But you know desire is stubborn. The more it is pushed into shadow, the more fiercely it flickers. Oddly, this vagueness sometimes creates spaces for tenderness. If no one can define what is forbidden, then you are free, at least for a moment, to find your own meaning. You recall the story of two women who lived together for decades, never marrying, never attracting much notice. They prayed together, kept house, tended a small garden. When one died, the other was allowed to keep her home, for services rendered in piety and friendship. No one asked questions, no one named the bond. It was easier, perhaps, not to know. You see the same pattern in art and poetry. A painting of two saints sharing a feast, their hands entwined beneath the table. A poem in which the beloved is always you, never he or she. The church may police the boundaries, but artists learn to blur them. You wonder what it would have been like to live in a world where words could be used freely, where love could be named. Would it have made things safer, or only more dangerous? Perhaps both. The danger of the sin without name is that it makes everyone vulnerable, but it also makes everyone complicit. If you cannot define the crime, you cannot be sure who is guilty. Sometimes, the refusal to name the sin takes on a life of its own. You read about sermons that go on for hours, warning against unspeakable acts, dangerous company, the path that leads to ruin. The congregation nods along, each person silently reassured that they are not the one being accused, until of course they are. You find yourself laughing despite everything at the sheer absurdity of it all. An entire society obsessed with a danger it can neither explain nor escape. There is a kind of resilience in this vagueness. You learn to hold your secrets close, to share your story only with those you trust completely. Every smile, every touch, every shared glance becomes precious. The world outside may be full of suspicion, but within the circle of trust, love is allowed to exist, nameless, but real. You notice too how the silence creates a bond among those who live on its edge. In the market square, in the monastery garden, at the city gates, you see the subtle nods, the brief glances, the signs that pass beneath the radar of authority. You are part of a fellowship of the unnamed, a family bound not by words, but by the shared experience of not being able to speak. Sometimes, the refusal to name desire turns into a kind of game. You invent euphemisms, inside jokes, secret nicknames. A pair of lovers are good friends. An old woman is eccentric. A young man is sensitive. You learn to listen for the tone, the emphasis, the hint of laughter behind the words. Language itself becomes a mask, a shield, a cloak to hide what cannot be shown. But you also know the cost. The longer you go without naming something, the harder it becomes to see clearly. Shame grows in the shadows, fed by silence. You sense it in yourself, in your friends, in the world at large, a weight that never quite lifts, a fear that keeps you from reaching out. You mourn the stories that were never told, the love that was never named. Historians still argue whether the silence was meant to protect or to punish. Some say it was a kindness, better to leave things unspoken than to risk violence. Others see it as a cruelty, a deliberate erasure. You suspect both are true. The silence offered a kind of safety, but it also suffocated. You live in the tension between the two, longing for words, fearing them at the same time. In rare moments, the silence is broken. A poet dares to write plainly. A preacher stumbles and names the sin out loud. A friend risks everything to speak the truth. The consequences are unpredictable. Sometimes laughter, sometimes tears, sometimes freedom. But each act of naming carves a crack in the wall, lets in a little light. You turn over in bed, eyes adjusting to the darkness, and imagine a world where desire is not nameless, where love is not a secret. You know it is a long way off, but even now, in the hush of night, you find comfort in the knowledge that you are not alone. Others too have survived the fog, lived through the silence, found ways to say what could not be said. The sin without name is a burden, but it is also a challenge. It calls you to invent, to endure, to imagine a different world. You whisper your own names in the dark, knowing that someday, somewhere, someone will hear and understand. You wake to the distant clatter of a city already alive, carts bouncing over cobbles, vendors hawking pears, the steady clang of a blacksmith's hammer. But your mind lingers somewhere else, in quiet chambers behind palace walls, in royal gardens where laughter always sounds rehearsed. If the ordinary people of the Middle Ages feared the gaze of neighbours, imagine the pressure on kings, queens, and those whose lives were etched in the public eye. Here, rumours about forbidden desire swirl like incense, thick and intoxicating. The higher you climb, the more dangerous the secrets become. You find yourself moving through the palace's shadowy corridors, noticing the way servants glance away, the way courtiers exchange whispers behind painted fans. Royalty, after all, are meant to embody the virtues of the realm: strength, wisdom, fidelity, and the ability to produce heirs. Lots and lots of heirs. Any deviation from this script, any whiff of improper affection, becomes fodder for both scandal and control. Yet, you hear it in the old stories and the not-so-secret gossip. Kings who kept favourites, queens who spent suspiciously long hours with their ladies-in-waiting, princes who delayed marriage and preferred the company of fellow knights. Sometimes these connections are recast as pure, loyal friendship. Sometimes they are painted as political alliances. Sometimes, though, the truth bubbles up, fleetingly, rebelliously, before being pressed back beneath the surface. Take Edward II of England, for example. His affection for Piers Gaveston was the talk of Europe. Chronicles dance around the subject. The king delighted in his company above all others. Gaveston alone was permitted his most private counsel. When Edward showered Gaveston with titles and gifts, the barons grumbled, some out of jealousy, some out of moral outrage, and some, perhaps, out of their own private fears. Gaveston was eventually exiled, then executed. The official charge was political misrule, but everyone knew there was more to the story. You think about how, even now, rumours cling to Edward like the scent of old roses, sweet and a little bitter, impossible to wash away. There are other stories, equally fraught, equally layered in secrecy. Richard the Lionheart, famed for his courage and his crusades, spent years with Philip II of France. Their alliance was celebrated, but also scrutinised. Songs were sung about their friendship, yet chroniclers note an affection that surpassed all others. When Richard was captured and ransomed, Philip reportedly wept. Was it love? Was it strategy? The line blurs, as always, and the silence of the record speaks as loudly as any poem. The royal courts of Europe were crowded stages for performance and concealment. Everyone watched, and everyone pretended not to watch. You hear about favourites in every kingdom, men who rise quickly in the king's esteem, given rooms close to the royal bedchamber, showered with gold and land. Some were surely ambitious courtiers, skilled at flattery and intrigue. But sometimes you sense a genuine connection, a laughter too easy, a touch too familiar, a sorrow too sharp when one is exiled or killed. Women too found ways to slip past the gaze of history. Queens and noblewomen surrounded by ladies-in-waiting often formed bonds described as sisterly or devoted. You read about Eleanor of Aquitaine and her inner circle, women who wrote poems for each other, who travelled together, who sometimes chose to remain unmarried despite family pressure. Their affection is framed as harmless, even wholesome, so long as it never challenges the order of marriage and succession. But when women's closeness became too obvious, too public, these same old anxieties surfaced. In one French court, 2 noblewomen are exiled for causing scandal among the ladies. No further details are recorded. In the Italian city-states, the rumours swirl faster. Accusations of tribadism, a word spoken only in hushed tones, rarely defined but always feared. Sometimes a lady's sudden disappearance is explained away by illness, a hasty marriage, or a call to a distant convent. Everyone nods, pretending not to know the real reason. One of the most peculiar and revealing fringe tidbits about royal courts is the role of gossip itself. Unlike the law courts, royal rumour mills could both destroy and protect. A king accused of unnatural affection might be ridiculed by rival factions, but he might also be defended by his own courtiers, who would rewrite stories and compose new ballads to obscure the truth. In some cases, the existence of a powerful favourite provided cover for others at court, who could hide their own secrets in the shadow of scandal. You picture the endless entertainments of the palace, masks, banquets, hunts, where glances are exchanged behind masks, messages passed in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. You imagine a courtier carefully sliding a poem into the pocket of a royal cloak, or a queen's favourite slipping a pressed flower beneath a pillow. Every gesture is layered with meaning, every smile is a test of trust. Sometimes desire at court is tolerated so long as it remains discreet, subordinate to the duties of marriage and inheritance. A king may have favourites, a queen may have devoted companions, so long as the bloodline is secured and the public scandal is kept at bay. But if rumour outpaces discretion, the punishments are swift: exile, imprisonment, even death. the court that was once a haven becomes a cage. Still, you find evidence that even within these strictures love flourished, hidden, coded, but fierce. In the margins of royal inventories, you find records of gifts exchanged, a jewelled comb, a pair of gloves, a songbird in a golden cage. In one Italian palace, the Chamberlain's diary records a masked ball where 2 noblemen danced together the whole night, and no one dared interrupt them. The next day, the city's preacher thundered against disorderly pleasures. The ball continued anyway. The arts, as ever, provide a safety valve. Court poets write verses about unattainable love, musicians compose duets for 2 voices meant for friends, and painters immortalize scenes of ambiguous affection. You can almost see the tension, the longing to speak plainly, the necessity of silence. Some royal favourites are even buried with their lords, their tombs inscribed with Latin verses about loyalty and devotion, carefully sidestepping the truth. There's a tale, half forgotten but still whispered in certain old cities, of a king who risked everything for his beloved page. The 2 would meet in the palace gardens at night, leaving tokens for each other beneath the ancient oak. When they were discovered, the king sent the boy away rather than see him killed. For the rest of his reign, the king visited the tree each night, leaving a rose on the lowest branch. No one dared remove the flowers. When the king died, the roses stopped blooming, and the gardeners whispered that the tree mourned its secret too. Even the language of architecture becomes part of this silent history. In castles across Europe you find hidden doors, passageways, small chambers tucked behind grand halls. Some were designed for escape, for intrigue, for keeping enemies at bay. But sometimes they served other, gentler purposes, a space to meet, to speak freely, to be oneself, if only for a moment. You think about all the secrets those walls have held, the stories never spoken aloud. You realise that in every court, every palace, every manor, there were always those who knew, who guessed, who kept the secrets. Some did so out of loyalty, others out of fear, and still others out of their own longing. There is a kinship here, a network of silent understanding spanning across rank and time. You wonder what it must have been like for those who dared to love in the spotlight, who risked not just reputation, but life itself. You marvel at their courage, the choice to reach for connection, even when it meant living on the edge of disaster. As the city outside your window quiets for the night, you find yourself thinking about those royal hearts, beating beneath layers of velvet and gold, guarded by protocol but vulnerable to longing. You think of all the glances that became legend, all the rumours that became history, all the loves that survived only in song and stone. You settle back, imagining the hush of a palace after midnight, the tap of footsteps in a distant hall, the brush of a hand against silk. The world outside may never know the truth, but you carry it with you. A reminder that even where shame was deepest and scrutiny was sharpest, love still found a way to flicker in the darkness. The palace fades into darkness, the velvet hush of night pressing in on gilded chambers and peasant huts alike. Now you listen to the quieter voices, the ones not chronicled in royal records or immortalized in marble. Instead, these voices belong to those who tried to fix what could not be named. The doctors, apothecaries, and learned men who claim to know the cure for desire. In the world of medieval medicine, queer longing is not just a sin but a sickness, a malady to be pitied, prodded, or punished according to the science of the day. You lie awake, imagining the clatter of a physician's cart arriving at dawn. The doctor steps down, bearded and self-assured, armed with vials, leeches, and a head full of ancient theories. For him, love that steps outside the lines isn't simply wicked, it's unnatural, and therefore must have a cause. What follows is a strange blend of genuine curiosity, superstition, and a great deal of confusion. Historians still argue whether the rise of medical explanations offered mercy to those accused, or only created new kinds of cages. The textbooks of the age are a tangle of ideas, equal parts logic and fantasy. You might read, in an old compendium, that desire for one's own sex is caused by an excess of heat in the liver, or an imbalance of humours, or even by spending too much time in the company of the wrong kind of people. The Greek physician Galen, whose theories ruled European medicine for centuries, classified everything, temperaments, emotions, even sexual preference, into neat, often nonsensical categories. Doctors in medieval Paris or Bologna took these ideas seriously, filling their treatises with elaborate diagnoses and treatments. Sometimes the cure was almost laughably benign. A new diet, more vigorous exercise, colder baths. In more severe cases, a patient might be sent on pilgrimage or prescribed bitter herbs and lengthy prayers. There were attempts at what modern ears would call conversion therapy, though without the formal name, confessions, rituals, even exorcisms. You think of the poor souls forced to drink potions or endure fasting, their only sin being the wrong kind of love. One peculiar tidbit comes from a 14th century physician who claimed that same-sex desire could be cured by sleeping with a particular stone beneath the pillow, preferably one blessed by a local saint. You wonder how many hopeful families pressed these stones into the hands of their children, praying for a miracle that never arrived. Other remedies were more dangerous: bleeding, blistering, or the application of hot irons to the seat of desire. You shiver, imagining the fear and pain behind such treatments, the hope that suffering might bring deliverance. Not all doctors were so cruel. There are hints, buried in correspondence and case notes, of physicians who saw desire not as evil, but as a mystery. Some counselled patients, advised parents to wait and hope for change, to avoid shame and violence if they could. A handful even hinted that love in any form was a force of nature, not a crime. "The heart is its own master," wrote one Venetian doctor, adding quietly, "and the body follows." His notes survive, faded and smudged, but you sense a quiet rebellion in his words. Still, the dominant mood is suspicion and shame. Doctors and priests often work together, trading cases, diagnosing souls as well as bodies. You imagine the scene: a young man brought to the local monastery, pale and trembling, surrounded by elders who speak in Latin as if words can ward off danger. He is questioned, prayed over, given herbs that taste of earth and iron. When nothing changes, the verdict is clear: more penance, more isolation, perhaps even exile. In some rare cases, he is sent to a distant abbey for spiritual and physical health. The journey is long and lonely. Some return, changed by time, or simply better at hiding. Others are never seen again. Women's experiences are, if anything, even more invisible. The rare mentions in medical texts are vague, blaming melancholy of the womb or the corrupting influence of bad company. Sometimes love between women is dismissed as childish play, easily outgrown until it isn't, and then the rules snap shut. If two women are caught together, a doctor might be summoned to restore natural order, but more often the matter is handled by silent threats or quiet banishment. Historians still debate whether medieval medicine's interest in queer desire was a sign of progress, a shift from punishment to pity, or merely another way to pathologize and control. You suspect it was both, tangled together. For every doctor who tried to help, there were many more who saw themselves as defenders of order, eager to root out anything unnatural. Medicine, after all, is rarely neutral. In the folk tradition, there are even stranger remedies. Midwives prescribe herbal teas said to cool the blood, or offer charms against restless dreaming. You hear stories of mothers sewing protective amulets into the linings of shirts, or fathers dragging their sons to riverbanks at dawn to wash away temptation. Sometimes the very rituals meant to heal become acts of violence. Sometimes they offer comfort, a hope that something, anything can change. The Church's medical manuals are just as conflicted. One notorious guide insists that men tempted by unnatural affection must avoid red meat, wine, and all spicy food, as if virtue could be boiled and stewed into existence. The same book recommends solitary prayer, long walks, and, failing all else, a pilgrimage to Rome or Jerusalem. The irony is thick. The world is full of saints rumoured to have loved deeply, even strangely, and pilgrims bring their own secrets to every holy site. Yet, through all the noise and confusion, you sense the persistence of longing. People adapt. They pretend to be cured, learn to hide, become experts at silence. You hear about the brotherhood of sufferers, young men and women who, driven together by suspicion and fear, form their own secret circles of care. They share stories, trade remedies, laugh quietly at the absurdity of it all. Did the stone work? One whispers. Only if you count dreaming of him every night, the other replies. You find comfort in the stories of those who resisted, who refused the cure, who ran away instead, who carved their own happiness out of the world's confusion. Sometimes these rebels are remembered as troublemakers, sometimes as saints, sometimes they are simply forgotten, their laughter echoing only in the quiet places where medicine and magic fail. One of the most heartbreaking stories is that of a monk who confessed, not to sin, but to a longing he could not name. The abbot, moved by his suffering, declared that love in any form is the work of God, though the world may misunderstand it. The monk was allowed to stay, his duties unchanged, his secret kept. Historians still debate whether this was mercy or just a practical decision. You sense that, for the monk, it was enough. The medieval world, for all its wisdom and wonder, never quite learned that lesson, but you know it now. The heart heals itself, given half a chance. The only cure for longing is kindness, and the only remedy for shame is to be seen and known exactly as you are. You drift towards sleep, feeling the comfort of that knowledge. Tomorrow the world will demand its cures, its rules, its boundaries. But tonight you rest in the freedom of understanding that love, in any form, is neither illness nor sin. It is simply, stubbornly human. Morning arrives soft and grey, the mist curling along the street like a whispered secret. You hear the gentle clatter of buckets at the well, a rooster crowing with more hope than certainty, and somewhere, the laughter of women at work. This is a world where men's stories usually fill the records, where kings and clerics decide what matters and what is written down. But if you pause and listen carefully, truly listen, you start to notice the quieter stories, the bonds between women that history's loudest voices did not want you to hear. You step into the day as a woman in the Middle Ages, your life measured in chores and careful glances. You know that, more than almost anyone, women have mastered the art of invisibility, your joys, your longings, your friendships all tucked into the folds of daily life. Here, where records are thin and rumours thick, love between women is nearly always hidden. Sometimes, though, the evidence glimmers in the corners, impossible to fully erase. There's something tender and rebellious in the way medieval women forge connections. Friendships grow deep, born out of necessity and proximity, in kitchens, at spinning wheels, in the fields, and behind the stone walls of convents. These bonds are called many things: companionship, spiritual sisterhood, sworn friendship. But you recognise the truth when you see it. A lingering touch on the wrist, a laugh that means more. A letter written in a hand that shakes with risk. Historians still argue whether the records of these close friendships hide the traces of romantic love, or whether later readers simply long for connection in a lonely world. You remember the story of Margaret and Joan, two millers' daughters, who grew up together on the riverbank, inseparable as children, and, when grown, refused all suitors. The parish register calls them peculiar in their loyalty, and the local priest mentions their habit of walking arm in arm to church. When Margaret falls ill, Joan nurses her day and night. At Margaret's burial, Joan weeps aloud, and is comforted by no one. Her grief is so deep that neighbours murmur about curses and unnatural affection. Afterward, Joan leaves town, her name vanishing from the records. But you know what really happened? A love story, written in invisible ink. Sometimes the traces are clearer in the convents. Women sent to nunneries, by family, by circumstance, or by calling, live together in close quarters, sharing prayers and secrets. Spiritual friendship is encouraged. Sisterly love is praised in sermons and letters. Yet the boundary between friendship and something more is blurred. "I would rather die than be parted from you," writes one nun to another in a surviving letter. The ink faded, but the longing undiminished. The convent walls both protect and confine, sheltering affection, but also making it dangerous if discovered. You imagine the way nuns invent small rituals to claim each other, sharing a single candle at Vespers, sitting side by side in the choir, exchanging tokens, rings, ribbons, scraps of lace. In some rare cases, records mention nuns punished for inordinate familiarity. The phrase is vague, but the punishments, separation, extra prayers, a transfer to another house, are real. You sense the pain behind these actions, the longing for a world where closeness could simply be celebrated, not shamed. In the countryside, women's bonds are harder to track. You hear about pairs of widows who live together, pooling their meagre resources and raising children side by side. In town, spinsters share small rooms above the shops, their lives intertwined. Sometimes these partnerships last a lifetime. You see their names mentioned together in wills, you find their graves side by side. The official documents are dry, for reasons of economy, companions in household, but you read between the lines. One of the quirkiest tidbits you uncover is the practice of wedded sisters, a term found in a handful of northern parish records. These were pairs of women who pledged to live together, share property, and care for one another as sisters ought. No church ceremony, no legal recognition, but a public acknowledgement nonetheless. Historians still debate whether this was a cover for romantic partnership or simply a strategy for survival in a world that offered few options to unmarried women. You suspect, as always, that the truth is both stranger and simpler than it seems. Women's stories are so often silenced, not just by censors, but by the daily grind of life. 1,000 small acts of care go unrecorded. A shared loaf of bread, a lock of hair braided with coloured thread, a whispered promise on a winter's night. You picture two women sitting by a hearth, hands intertwined, sharing news and hopes, their love a quiet flame in a cold world. The risks are real. If affection between women draws too much attention, the consequences can be harsh. There are tales of women accused of unnatural practices, forced to confess or be cast out. Sometimes the church intervenes. More often, it is the village that polices its own, whispering and shunning until silence reigns. The fear is not always loud, but it is persistent. You grow used to hiding your feelings, to smiling with your lips and not your eyes. Yet, in this atmosphere of scrutiny, you see moments of remarkable courage. Women who refuse to be parted, who travel together from town to town, inventing new names and new stories as they go. You read of a pair of sisters who take up weaving in a distant city, never marrying, always at each other's side. When one dies, the other arranges the funeral, refusing to let the local priest speak ill of their bond. The townsfolk gossip, but no one interferes. The story survives, in fragments, in rumour and song. You wonder what the world would look like if these stories were told openly, if love between women was as celebrated as any knight's devotion to his king. Would Joan have stayed by Margaret's grave? Would the nuns have exchanged vows without fear? Would spinsters have been honoured for their loyalty, rather than pitied for their solitude? Historians still debate whether the erasure of women's queer bonds was a conscious act or simply a byproduct of indifference. You know, deep down, that it is both, a mixture of oversight, dismissal, and sometimes deliberate silence. The world is built on stories, and for too long women's stories have been left out. Yet, despite everything, the record endures. You find it in marginal notes, in letters, in the way two names are linked again and again across decades. You see it in the lives of those who loved without a name, who found solace in each other's company even when the world looked away. There is a quiet power in this kind of survival. You realise that, in a way, being invisible is its own rebellion. The love between women, though rarely named, slips through the cracks of history. It persists in memory, in habit, in the hush of early morning. It survives because it must, because it is woven into the fabric of daily life. You lie down, the world outside fading into mist and shadow. You know that history may never give these women their due, but you can carry their memory forward. A quiet inheritance, a love that endures even in silence. The night is thick and quiet now, candlelight flickering on old stone. You rest in that hush, mind wandering through the dark, echoing halls of memory and art. Tonight you trace another hidden path, one not just of words and whispers, but of images. The world of medieval art and its quiet rebellion. In a society obsessed with order and appearances, sometimes what cannot be said is painted, carved, or woven. And so you find, scattered across cathedrals and chapels, margins and manuscripts, a secret visual language, desire encoded in gold leaf, longing disguised as devotion, love caught in the tilt of a saint's head or the outstretched hand of a companion. At first glance, medieval art seemed like a locked box. The saints are pious, the knights noble, the women demure and distant. The rules of Christian art, who may touch, who may look, who may stand close, are strict, or seem to be. But you quickly learn that every rule invites a game, and every game has its players. You look closer and start to notice the oddities, the slippages, the places where reality intrudes on the ideal. Historians still argue whether medieval artists meant to encode hidden messages of queer love, or whether we read too much into a glance or a gesture. But the patterns repeat, and you know that art, like life, finds its own way of telling the truth. You remember the illuminated manuscripts, those prayer books and psalters made for the wealthy or the devout. Their margins teem with strange creatures, playful scenes, and sometimes oddly intimate human figures. There's the image of two men, heads bent close, their hands entwined beneath a shared cloak. In another, a pair of women trade rings, their faces soft with emotion, watched only by a bemused rabbit. Some of these images are whimsical, jokes for the reader alone. Others you sense are declarations, a visual echo of words left unwritten. It's not just the margins. Sometimes right in the heart of sacred space, queer longing is visible for those who know how to see it. Stained glass windows depict saints whose bonds are described as closer than brothers. Sebastian, beloved by many for his beauty and his suffering. John the Evangelist, resting against Christ's breast. The language of scripture blurs with the language of desire, and you sense the comfort these images might have offered to those living in silence. Were these friendships? Were they more? The ambiguity is itself a gift. There's something quietly thrilling about finding yourself in art, especially when the rest of the world would rather you remain invisible. You imagine a monk tasked with illuminating a text, painting a figure with a face just like that of his dearest friend. Or a nun embroidering a tapestry for the chapel, hiding two birds nestled together in a border of leaves. In these small acts you see a kind of resistance, gentle, persistent, necessary. One of the most peculiar and charming tidbits you stumble upon is the medieval custom of misericords, the tiny, often hidden carvings under the folding seats of choir stalls. Because they were rarely seen by the congregation, carvers took liberties. Some depict animals or mythical beasts, but others show pairs of men or women engaged in acts of affection. A hand on a shoulder, a kiss, a dance. Historians still debate whether these images were simply playful or something more, but you like to think they were small declarations, tiny prayers carved in wood. I was here. I loved. Art is full of code. In the margins of a book of hours you spot two hairs sitting side by side, an old symbol of fidelity and secret partnership. On the wall of a ruined chapel, a faded fresco shows David and Jonathan in an embrace, their fingers twined together as if caught mid-promise. The story is biblical, yes, but the pose is intimate, too close for accident. You think of all the times artists were asked to paint what was expected, and chose instead to paint what was true. Historians still argue whether medieval viewers noticed or cared about these subtle signals. Some say the world was too steeped in tradition to see the difference. Others claim that the signs were recognised, cherished in secret by those who needed them. You know how a glance, a touch, a flower painted on the edge of a saint's robe can mean everything to someone searching for themselves in a hostile world. Sometimes the art's rebellion is bolder. There are tales of churches where the statues of certain saints, Sebastian again, or Sergius and Bacchus, become gathering points for those who live on the margins. Pilgrims leave offerings, flowers, ribbons, scraps of verse. A story from northern Spain tells of a shrine where women prayed together for strength, tying knots in their scarves as a secret sign of hope and solidarity. The clergy turn a blind eye or perhaps recognise something holy in this unspoken devotion. Not all art survives. Fires, iconoclasm, centuries of repainting and renovation have erased much of what once was. But even in fragments, the message lingers. A scrap of tapestry here, a broken tile there, a love poem scribbled in the margin of a missal. You see how art keeps the record when words fail. How longing survives even the strictest censorship. In the secular world, art was sometimes even more daring. Courtly tapestries depict scenes of feasting and dance, with couples whose genders are left deliberately ambiguous. In the carvings that adorn castles and manors, pairs of men hunt together, arms linked, their closeness a gentle challenge to the rules. Sometimes the jokes are bawdy, a wink at the audience. Sometimes the beauty is open and raw. You pause, thinking of a manuscript from the Low Countries, where two women are pictured weaving a garland, their fingers interlaced with flowers. The scribe's note below reads, "Love grows in the places it is tended." Was it meant as a proverb, or was it the truth, hidden in plain sight? You wonder how many artists risked rebuke or worse for these small acts of honesty. How many readers and viewers saw themselves reflected even for a moment? There are stories too of art as sanctuary. In the busy, anonymous space of a great cathedral, a solitary figure studies a painted panel, heart racing at the sight of a familiar gesture. In the hush of a chapel, someone lingers before a statue, fingertips grazing the cool stone, feeling seen for the first time in days. These moments are rare, but you know they happened. Sometimes you think, art is the only place where the soul can speak. One of the more striking scholarly debates is over the hidden meanings in religious icons. Was the closeness of certain saints a coded nod to forbidden love, or simply a relic of a culture that valued friendship in ways we struggle to understand today? You imagine both are true, that medieval artists and viewers were as complex as any of us, sometimes daring, sometimes careful, always hoping for a little more light in the darkness. As you drift through the imagined galleries of the past, you find comfort in the knowledge that queer desire, though buried in shame, has always found ways to surface. Art is patient, art is sly. Where words must whisper, images can linger on a page or a wall for centuries waiting to be seen. You settle into sleep, dreaming of gold and colour, of tapestries where every thread is a promise, of carved wood smooth with centuries of touch. You're not alone, you are part of an endless story, written in images as much as words. The world outside may choose blindness, but the artist's hand always knows love is worth painting again and again, no matter who tries to look away. Night presses in again, deep and expectant, as you wander further into the shadowed heart of medieval power. The cathedral, the monastery, the bishop's palace. For all the church's loud condemnations of unnatural sin, you know that stone walls hold more than sermons and secrets. They house the very people who preach against desire while wrestling with it in the dark. Tonight, you glimpse the lives of those whose robes mark them as holy, but whose hearts, like anyone's, remain unpredictable and wild. Here, hypocrisy is both armour and burden. Here, the keepers of the rules break them most quietly of all. You drift through the echoing nave, past the glow of candles and the cool hush of incense. The clergy move among the shadows, monks and priests and abbots, faces set and eyes averted. To the world, these are men, and sometimes women, above reproach. trusted with the soul's keeping, models of restraint. But behind closed doors, a different story unfolds. Desire does not disappear with a vow. It grows more clever, more careful, more desperate. The history books rarely record it, but you feel it, humming beneath every chanted prayer. It is not only the famous who falter. In every priory and abbey stories circulate, you hear of Brother Anselm, beloved by all for his gentle voice and quick wit, who shares his cell with a series of novices. When the abbot questions the arrangement, Anselm replies, "We pray more earnestly together, for the soul needs company in the night." Was it true? Perhaps. The lines between spiritual guidance and affection are easily blurred, especially in a world where the heart is trained to seek solace where it can. One quirky tidbit you discover is the tradition of the bedfellow, a common arrangement in monastic life, where two monks or nuns share a bed for warmth, especially in winter. The official line is practicality. The reality is, often, intimacy. In some cases, lifelong bonds are formed, deep and affectionate if not always romantic. Still, the potential for desire is ever present, and the rules are revised again and again. No unnecessary touching after dark. No sharing of private confession outside the chapel. No gifts exchanged without permission. Each new regulation is a tacit admission that rules alone cannot govern the heart. You think of the hours spent in the cloister garden, where monks pace together, heads bent close in conversation. Of the scriptorium, where a gentle hand guides another's pen. Of the nuns who sit together in the choir, voices blending, gazes meeting across the flicker of candlelight. Some of these moments are innocent, some are not. All are watched, all are whispered about. Punishments vary with the mood of the age. Sometimes a scandal is hushed up quietly. One party transferred to a distant house, the other assigned more solitary tasks. Sometimes confessions are extracted, penances assigned, weeks of fasting or silence imposed. In extreme cases, expulsion or public shaming follows. Yet, as you sift through the records, you find as many stories of leniency as of harshness. Some abbots, perhaps remembering their own youth, choose mercy. Some abbesses look the other way, understanding the hunger for connection in a lonely world. Historians still debate whether the prevalence of same-sex desire in cloisters was higher than in the outside world, or simply more visible because of the enforced intimacy. The truth is probably both. Remove the distractions of daily life, compress people into small spaces, deny them family and romance, and affection blooms in every corner. Sometimes it is a comfort, sometimes it is a scandal. You find hints of this double life even in the art and poetry produced by the clergy. Hymns that speak of longing, more piercing than the nails of the cross. Prayers that beg for union so complete as to be inseparable. Some of the great mystics write of their love for Christ in language so sensual that later scholars scramble to explain it away. Others are more circumspect, weaving their longing into parables and fables. A nun in the 13th century writes to her dearest sister, describing dreams of walking hand in hand through a heavenly garden. The letter survives, buried in a box of unrelated papers, perhaps on purpose. One of the most peculiar practices you find is the confession of temptation, an official part of spiritual discipline. A monk or nun is encouraged to confess not just sins, but impure thoughts. Some confessors are harsh, others gentle. Sometimes the act of confession brings relief and support. Sometimes it opens the door to blackmail or abuse. The line between care and control is always thin. You wonder how many priests and nuns found themselves comforting the very souls they were supposed to correct. How many whispered, late at night, "You are not alone in this." How many kept the secret out of pity, out of kinship, out of their own desire? You read of a priest in Burgundy, beloved by his flock for his kindness and humour, who lived his whole life with another man, a servant named Etienne. When the priest died, Etienne was allowed to keep his room in the rectory. Parishioners later recalled that the two were as close as brothers and happier than most. No one called it a sin, at least not aloud. The church buried the story in a footnote, but the villagers remembered. Not every story ends kindly. There are tales of priests exposed, driven from their posts, forced to beg for bread in distant towns, of nuns accused of inordinate affection, sent to solitary cells or even tried as witches. The risks were great, and the shame even greater, because hypocrisy is a heavier burden than honesty. Yet, for every fall from grace, there are dozens of stories where nothing was said, where understanding prevailed, if only in silence. One of the strangest scholarly debates involves the saints themselves. Some hagiographies are so full of intense same-sex devotion that later editors felt compelled to tone them down, recasting passionate friendships as mere piety. You smile at the thought, history itself editing out the blush, airbrushing the heart. But the old words survive, for those who look hard enough. You marvel at the way the church, so obsessed with purity, is always a house divided. Sermons thunder against desire, but candles still burn in chapels where forbidden prayers are whispered. Cloisters ring with the sound of hymns, but also with laughter and longing. You realise that the holiest places are also the most human, full of contradiction, full of need. As the hour grows late, you picture the solitary monk staring at the stars, the abbess listening to her own heartbeat, the priest waking in the night to memories he cannot pray away. You think of the courage it takes to preach compassion while battling your own longing, of the shame that grows in the cracks between what is taught and what is lived. Yet, for all the hypocrisy, you find moments of real grace. An old bishop close to death blesses the friend of his youth and asks to be buried beside him. A nun writes in her diary, "Love is God's greatest gift even when the world misunderstands." A priest confides to a dying parishioner, "We all carry secrets. What matters is how we love." You drift towards sleep, soothed by the knowledge that even behind the highest walls love finds a way. The church's condemnation was loud, but the quiet rebellion of the heart was louder if you knew where to listen. Tonight, you lie beneath a ceiling webbed with old beams, the world beyond your shutters humming with distant rain. In this quiet, you reflect on the strange paradoxes of medieval shame, how, for all its dangers, it never quite managed to kill joy. Fear and secrecy shaped queer desire, but so did laughter, mischief, and the everyday stubbornness of people who simply refused to give up on connection. Shame is a heavy burden, yes, but humans have always found ways to lighten the load. With wit, with ritual, with tiny, joyful acts of rebellion. You think of the humour that flourished in the margins of a world ruled by anxiety. Medieval jesters, minstrels, and market fools, those licensed outsiders, were often allowed to poke fun at the rules everyone else obeyed. You hear it in the stories told at village feasts, the sly double meanings in riddles, the folk songs passed from mouth to mouth. When directness would have been fatal, people learned to hide their laughter in plain sight. You recall the famous carnival season, that topsy-turvy time when peasants dressed as kings, men as women, and the world's order was joyfully inverted. In those brief days before Lent, boundaries blurred and mockery reigned. Even the most pious could join in, blaming the devil if things went a little too far. Historians still argue whether carnival simply released the pressure of daily repression, or if it offered a taste, however fleeting, of genuine freedom. Either way, you know it was a space where desire could breathe. In some villages, couples danced together in any combination they pleased, their laughter loud enough to drown out even the sharpest tongue. You learn about mock weddings performed by wandering minstrels, where 2 men or 2 women would be paired for the amusement of the crowd. Was it always a joke? Perhaps not. The audience laughed, the church frowned, but in the glow of torches and cider, some hearts leapt with possibility. Sometimes a jest, sometimes a hope. These rituals left behind both memories and questions. It's a reminder that humour, for all its mischief, can be a cloak for longing, a shield for truth. One of the quirkiest tidbits you discover comes from French farces and miracle plays. Public dramas packed with sly references to unnatural affection, always disguised as jokes about tailors, bakers, or monks. The playwrights slipped in double meanings, confident their audience would catch the joke. In some towns, the lines between ridicule and sympathy were blurred. Laughter could cut, but it could also connect. If you were clever, if you knew how to listen, you could find yourself seen, and sometimes, just sometimes, accepted. You realise how much power there is in shared amusement. Laughter creates a community of those in the know. You remember the story of two village women who, at a wedding feast, swapped shoes under the table, a sign, known only to them, of a secret promise. Or the guild apprentices who carved their initials together on the back of a church bench, joking that the priest would never notice. In these small gestures, you sense not just rebellion, but affection, a refusal to let shame have the last word. Even the church, for all its grimness, couldn't escape a little comedy. Medieval sermons are full of warnings about the dangers of laughter, of idle jesting leading to sin. But you find records of parish feasts where the priest himself joins the dance, where the line between rebuke and indulgence grows thin. In the chaos of the marketplace, you picture a friar sharing a wink with a butcher's son, a group of boys teasing each other with old rhymes about forbidden company. The laughter is sometimes cruel, sometimes kind, but always proof that life cannot be wholly tamed. You read about the Feast of Fools, a festival so notorious that church authorities tried, and often failed, to suppress it. During this celebration, the youngest clerics would dress as bishops, process through the town, and stage mock ceremonies that lampooned authority. Underneath the farce, however, lay a longing for connection, for a world where roles could shift, if only for a day. The world upside down, the chroniclers called it. You imagine how freeing it must have felt to drop the mask for even a few hours. Sometimes, humour became a subtle weapon. Satyrs and fabliaux, short, bawdy tales, survived for centuries by skewering the hypocrisy of the powerful. You find one tale about a priest so obsessed with rooting out unnatural sin that he ends up tangled in his own desires, exposed to the laughter of his flock. Another story features a widow who tricks a village into believing she can detect secret vice, making a small fortune before being unmasked by a group of giggling girls. In each tale, the message is clear. Take yourself too seriously, and you will be undone by your own folly. You notice that humour is not just a tool for survival, it is a way of reclaiming pride. People on the margins learn to turn the joke back on their accusers, to turn shame into a performance that both hides and reveals. The jester's cap, the mocking song, the sly glance, all are ways of saying, you cannot hurt me if I choose to laugh first. One odd touching custom from some Italian towns involved the midnight confessional. During certain feast days, neighbours would gather in the square and confess their smallest sins, half-truths, pranks, hidden crushes, safe in the anonymity of laughter. The real secrets, of course, remained unspoken, but the ritual itself offered relief, a way to share the burden of shame. You think of the laughter echoing into the night, covering pain with warmth. Historians still debate whether all this humour truly made life easier for queer people, or if it merely dulled the edge of cruelty. You sense that the answer is complicated. Laughter did not erase danger, nor did it guarantee acceptance. But it did create cracks in the wall, spaces where people could breathe, moments when the mask could slip. You marvel at how inventive the oppressed can be. In the face of scrutiny, people find ways to signal, to joke, to celebrate. You imagine a secret gathering on the edge of town, wine, song, and sly winks. The official reason might be a saint's day or a harvest festival, but you know what really matters is the company, the chance to forget fear for an evening. And you notice how, even centuries later, these rituals and jokes persist in memory. A story is told, a song is sung, and those who know smile knowingly. The world changes, but the longing for connection, for a little joy in the darkness, stays the same. You wonder what it would feel like to live without the constant pressure of shame, to let laughter be laughter, not armour. You hope one day that such a world will exist. But for now, you take comfort in the ingenuity of the past. in the stubborn cheer that outlasts even the harshest rules. As you turn out your lamp and listen to the rain, you realise that laughter, shared, sly or secret, has always been a kind of freedom. In the medieval night, where shame rules and silence is safety, joy slips through the cracks, bright and brave. You smile, knowing that as long as people can laugh together, shame will never be all-powerful. You breathe in the soft darkness, hearing the slow hush of rain against stone, and let your mind drift across centuries of longing, laughter, fear, and hope. In these closing hours of night, you walk through all the secret passages that shame built, and all the hidden gardens where courage still blooms. You know now that to live with queer desire in the Middle Ages was to live always between the lines, the glances, the silences, the jokes. But it was also impossibly to live. You think of everything you've witnessed, the hidden messages folded into poems, the letters burned but not forgotten, the embraces under the cloisters, the private language of ribbons and rosemary and longing looks. You remember the faces, Margaret and Joan, Brother Anselm, the unnamed lovers who left only initials behind, the royal favourites and the village friends, the nuns who risked everything for a moment of warmth in a world grown cold. Their lives weren't only a story of shame, they were a story of persistence and possibility. Because shame, though powerful, never managed to erase love. For every law, there was a loophole. For every rule, a way to bend. People became experts at making do, at finding joy in the narrowest cracks of freedom, at turning the tools of repression into the raw material for hope. You see it in the secret parties on carnival nights, the sly winks at market stalls, the comforting presence of a bedfellow on winter's coldest nights. There is pain, yes, so much pain. But there is also a stubborn streak of joy that nothing, not even centuries of silence, could stamp out. You wonder how it was possible, how people kept going with so much against them. Some found comfort in faith, twisting its words to fit their hearts. Some found it in rebellion, in laughter, in stories shared by candlelight, in the softness of a friend's hand in the dark. Others learned to carry their longing in silence, transforming it into art or prayer or quiet acts of kindness. Historians still argue whether this was survival or resistance, whether it was self-betrayal or the truest form of courage. You realise gently that it was all of these things at once. You think of the churches, the courts, the feasts and festivals, the laughter and the exile, the coded gestures and the coded silences. You see how every layer of shame built a hidden world within the ordinary one, a shadow world that was sometimes lonely but never truly empty. In this world, every risk is a triumph, every act of tenderness a victory. You marvel at the tenacity it takes to carve out moments of happiness in a culture designed to snuff them out. One of the strangest, most beautiful quirks you find is the way the medieval world, for all its obsession with boundaries, never quite managed to close every door. There was always a crack, a loophole, a moment of mercy. The same church that thundered against unnatural sin also taught forgiveness. The same city that banished the dangerous sometimes welcomed them back in secret. You hear of monks allowed to keep their dearest friends, of queens who travelled with their companions, of artists whose paintings outlived their accusers. Shame was never total. Hope somehow always found a way in. You know that shame is not just a burden, but a teacher, a hard one perhaps, but a real one. It teaches the value of kindness, of solidarity, of all the secret signs and rituals that say, I see you, I know you, I will keep your secret safe. In the darkest hours you recognise the strength it takes to reach for another person, to risk everything for love or comfort or even just understanding. As you lie back, the rain softening on the roof, you feel the truth settle over you like a quilt. The Middle Ages were full of shame, yes, but they were also full of life. Even in the deepest shadows there were always pockets of light. Even when fear ruled the day, the night belonged to those who dared to dream, to touch, to whisper what could not be spoken. You wonder what it would feel like to live without that shame, to let desire be ordinary, to let love be love. You hope that day is coming, or perhaps is already here, in the quiet courage of those who survived, in the stories still told in kitchens and bedrooms and midnight conversations. You see your own reflection in those who came before, and you know, survival is an inheritance, joy is a legacy, and you are never, ever alone. Tonight you rest in the company of centuries, the poets and painters, the hidden saints, the nameless rebels. You close your eyes, and their memory surrounds you. Love hidden, but not lost. Shame endured, but never triumphant. Hope shining through the cracks. Now let your breath soften. Let your shoulders loosen and your jaw unclench. Picture the old city behind your eyes, its narrow lanes washed clean by gentle rain, the marketplace silent at last, the lanterns dimmed. Imagine all the secrets settled into the stone, each story safe, each memory cherished, nothing lost to time. The night is safe now, heavy with the promise of rest. You feel the warmth of every hand that ever reached for comfort, the echo of every laugh that slipped past fear. The shame of the past dissolves, fading into a gentle hush. Only the steady rhythm of your own breath remains, grounding you in this moment, this bed, this peace. Let every worry drop away, as if you were lowering a heavy cloak. The world's questions will wait for you in the morning. For now, you are allowed to just be, a quiet soul at ease, held in the long memory of those who survived before you. Let the hush become complete, the darkness a soft blanket, the story a lullaby you carry into your dreams. If you listen closely, you can still hear the heartbeats of the past, steady and reassuring. You're not alone, and you never were. The night holds you. Sleep comes gently, slowly, promising comfort and renewal. Let yourself drift. Tomorrow you wake with hope, and tonight you are home. Sweet dreams.